in, switch it on there, which I know many of you have. And of course, fitting it there with the 17-inch wheels from a 2007 model. But apart from that, it's pretty standard. It's probably a good car for Dan to talk you through. Are you ready to go, Dan?
Yeah, can do.
Okay.
Sorry. You were just pointing me all day.
Yeah,
so.
I'm going to point it.
So yeah, begin with probably 3-step apologies on this one. First one is the attire. I've got a few S2000 t-shirts, but I don't necessarily want to get them all covered in shit. Second one is the hair. 3 months lockdown, what are you going to do? And the final part is this actually, as I say, you've probably seen already, this actually isn't my car. Originally, I was planning to go through a detail and more of an expose on my one because I was hoping to get it back from the body shop, but also because of Corona, that's still stuck up north. It's been painted, but I can't go and get it yet, or it's not back here for another reason. So that's the other apology. So I'm stuck in here with this old wreck and the car that he has.
And he's not talking about me there.
Yeah. So there we are. So again, no real experience with a lockdown live event. So there's any number of jobs you could do yourself on an S2000 if you're keen DIYs. It's not difficult. It's certainly not a complicated car to work on. What we'll try and achieve, or we'll try and achieve in the next couple of hours, is if there's something you particularly want to see or are thinking about doing and you want sort of a heads up and maybe there isn't already information on YouTube or the forum or something, then ask it now and we can do it. Within reason, obviously, there are some very large and very complicated jobs which is you wouldn't want to sit and watch me do, I'm fairly certain. But if you want to know the outline of how to do it, just ask and I'll sort of go underneath the car or under the bonnet or whatever and show you what you need to be looking out for. Or if it's a smaller job or a problem you have yourself or it's a modification you want to make, then ask it and we'll try. The car's been in the garage for about an hour now, so it's cooling down. That's relevant because there's certain jobs you'll want to do with a cold engine as opposed to a hot one. And I can, as much detail as you might want to know about why that is and what to watch out for. So that's really my bit. That's all I would say. So over to you in a manner of speaking. Tell us what you want to see. Do we unmute now?
I think we've got a couple of messages come in.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at those. Could you maybe go landscape or just when he's working? Yes, we can do that.
That's me.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'm quite tall, so I need to be sort of in that way, I think. Well, lockdown again, I've got a bit wider.
And Pip, is fish and chips the only thing we eat? Okay.
I'll answer that.
Right. So yeah, does that work if we go landscape like that?
No.
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 It's sideways.
Okay.
It's fine. It's fine.
It's fine.
All right. Okay. We'll work
We
it
can
out.
use my phone. What?
Well, we can switch between the two,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Okay. So
where to start then? Really, big jobs, small jobs, 3 bags full jobs. We can do So the most common things, if I just sort of talk about the things that you're likely to encounter on S2000s, not just the older models, but right up to the last model year, 2009, 2010. So seized or sticking brake calipers, very, very common as an unfortunate side effect of our climate where the roads are salted and just general moisture ingress that you get for rain and other things. The TCT that was mentioned earlier, the timing chain tensioner, it's not usually a sudden failure item. You get some early warning, you get ticking noises, clacking noises, sometimes at start-up, sometimes when the engine's very warm, sometimes both. There's a number of fixes, some more economical than others that I can show you. I can show you one today and we can talk through the other options. Underneath the car, you can have over time a vibration from what's known as worn CV cups or drive shaft cups. That's a larger job to actually do, and Andy doesn't actually need it doing for a different reason, but I could show you where that is, what it looks like, how you might go about doing it, or what's involved if you wanted to pay a garage to do so. Valve adjustments, again, that's not a new thing or even a Honda specific thing, but there are some subtleties to doing on this particular car that might be worth talking about. Lots of videos on YouTube, and I think even on the forum there's been some very good how-tos. So I certainly wouldn't want to reinvent the wheel on that one, but I can show you what to look out for. I can show you around all aspects of the car if you were to do a full service yourself, how to change each part, and again, what to look out for. Andy's car's ever so slightly not standard, as he said, so a few things like swapping the air filter wouldn't necessarily be applicable, but I could talk through the same process. What else goes wrong? Rattle on deceleration. That's linked to something to do with the clutch on earlier cars. Again, I can't feasibly take the gearbox out to show you the clutch itself, but I can show you a clutch, and I can show you the part that I have one on the shelf. I can show you the part that actually wears down and causes that noise, and whether that's something you'd need to fix. Soft tops themselves, the leaks and the wear items are fairly well known, fairly well documented on the forum, but we can sort of walk through that and some quick and easy fixes if you do have that. Sometimes as simple as just greasing a rubber seal. Sometimes you can slot some bolt holes to make the roof sit a bit tighter, you know, a bit less wind noise, those kind of things. I wouldn't really want to get too much into rust and corrosion. That is a thing on certainly on, well, all cars, but Japanese cars and certainly Hondas. We can show you the points that they go. It is linked on the rear end of the car to do with poorly draining soft tops or poorly fitting boot seals and other things like that. We can have those common points. Brakes, and so brake refurbing we spoke about, it's not seized calipers, but how to service them, greasing the sliding pins, bleeding brake fluid, so on and so forth.
We have a question from Neil. Neil says, any tips on removing the Palmer security? Is that something you can help with?
Yes, the easiest way to do that is if you see Back to the Future, get yourself a time machine and go back to before it was put in. That would be the easiest way to do it. But if you don't have that luxury, again, this does actually have the Hamilton and Palmer alarm on this car. A lot of early cars did, I think. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. 2004 or the MY04 model year cars got rid of it. They didn't have it. They had a slightly different key. Removal is not something that I don't think there's going to be any specific points to watch out for. It's going to be a matter of finding the unit and all the mechanisms, which are usually, in my experience, just cable tied up and under the dash. So you want to look out for that. It has its own fuse pack, its own fuse block, which is under there as well. Nothing really special I can advise you on. Find that fuse block and find everything that it connects to, but without going into a really lengthy electronics diagnosis. All the alarm's job itself, fundamentally, the alarm and the immobiliser, is to interrupt the signal that would otherwise be received when the keys turn to the full ignition position. So it's a matter of tracing those wires to either side of that connection, removing the unit and reconnecting them. That assumes, of course, that you're not going to have any alarm after that. The majority of times, most people will upgrade a H&P alarm to an aftermarket one. Toad, Clifford are some of the more older ones, but the more reliable ones, I think. So, again, I could show you the wiring or bits of the wiring under the dash if you want to see that, but for the lighting and the space that's available, you're just going to be looking at a collection of black wires, probably. So apologies if that's not more helpful.
Tim's asking, do you fancy removing the front bumper? I'm assuming that's to just show how it's done.
I can remove the front, and it's your car?
Yeah, that's fine, I've got no problem.
So do you want me to use tools, or do you want me to use a saw? What's the preference? I'm guessing we'll use
tools on this. Tim, is it just so you can see how that's done, or is there anything in particular you want to see when we get there?
It's the one thing I haven't removed off mine, and I know there's some bolts on the inside of the inner fenders that you've got to remove, and then I've just not actually been brave enough to do it without breaking some. I know it's fastened underneath on the under tray and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a good job. We can do that now because that's not engine temp dependent. You mentioned breaking bolts. That's a very, very relevant thing to this job. I've not actually removed Andy's. I've done a few jobs on Andy's car over the last few years, but I don't think we've actually removed that one off the top.
I've replaced the under tray, so those under tray bolts should be pretty okay.
Yes, that's a good point. I'll show you exactly what to watch out for when we go. But if you haven't done that, or as Andy has just said, it's a very, very high chance, depending on if your car's a go-to queen or not, that you'll go to undo some of the 10mm or 10mm head, 6mm thread bolts underneath, and they'll feel extremely tight. So you put a bit more leverage on them, and you're not actually undoing them. What you're doing is you're turning a rusted spire clip, which is a clip that looks a bit like this. It is pinched together with a bolt, and it will actually twist and rip out the plastic of the under tray. and then cue the swearing and usually a replacement under tray. So
and that's exactly what happened when I did it. But I just went off onto eBay, bought a set of spire clips and bolts for, I think it was about £8 or something like that.
Yeah.
And happy. But there are still some tears on the under tray itself. But,
yeah, it's very common. So I'll show you a sympathetic way to do it. But if you are going to tackle this job, I'll show you the points degrees. Get yourself some WD-40 or Plus Gas or whatever your lubricant or lubricating spray of choice is, and try and get those things soaking at least a couple of days before. Might just make your life easier. Normally, when I come across a really rusted fixing, I'll use heat to get it out. So either a welding torch or I have an induction heater. But of course, you can't do it in an area with plastic because it would just completely melt. So you're absolutely at the mercy of penetrating sprays, basically. So in the absence of any other,
I was going to say, I think we have had the front bumper off of this because for the radiator replacement.
No, you can do that in situ.
Oh, we did that in situ.
Yeah,
okay, fair enough. Okay, shall we maybe give
if
that a go?
If there's no other suggestions, we'll start with that one.
So if the lighting on this isn't great, then give me a shout. I do have a lighting rig I can put up to this, but Dan, go for it.
Before we get started, the car's actually on a mini ramp at the moment called Quick Jack. Unless you particularly want to see me plugging it in and various fetching angles of my arse as I reach under the car, then I suggest you go get a cup of tea, coffee. At this time on a day it is raining, or use the facilities or something. I'll be a couple of minutes. We'll get the car in the air and you get a much clearer view on what we're trying to do.
Yep.
Okay.
Whilst Dan's preparing for that, firstly, my apologies for not doing a video myself. I was going to do one about the meets we have in Surrey. Maybe I'll do one a bit later on, perhaps, and we can get that uploaded to the usual feed. But yeah, we are planning on getting Surrey meets going again as soon as we can. Obviously, opening the pubs again on the 4th of July. That's going to really help out with that. But I think to some extent it's going to depend on the restrictions that we've got. It's a bit of a shame. We did have some really great meets lined up for this year, particularly the Cranley Classic Car Show, which is in, I think it was August this year. Unfortunately, they've made the decision to not go ahead with that this year. And that is one of the biggest ones in the south of England. We've had a stand there, I think, now for probably about 4 or 5 years. And it is a really great show. But hopefully 2021, we can get that one up and running again. Sadly, we used to do the Dunsfold Air Show. Sadly, Dunsfold Air Show is no longer. I'd be quite surprised, to be honest with you, if there was many air shows that are going to come back pretty soon. But we are looking for other events that we can get involved with down in the south, down in Surrey, Sussex, Kent, and Hampshire way. But we'll keep you posted on some of those. But if anyone does have any ideas for events in the area south of London, then by all means give me a shout, or give Ian a shout, or Steve. And we'll see what we can do to set that up.
Dan, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I've just realised I've been requested that I want to see this front bumper removed. I have to go offline at 11:30 for a bit. Could you do it later?
Okay.
Could you do it later?
Yeah, Ian, I presume we're recording this, so it'll go up on the YouTube feed anyway, won't it?
Yeah, if it's recorded, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do it, and then you can watch it back on YouTube a bit later, perhaps.
Okay, yeah, I've got some other
Yes, sorry, we've got to get the GoPro set up. Yeah,
we have got to get the GoPro set up.
Yeah.
You want to do that, and then
I'm just going to put you on pause while Dan gets the car up. So yeah, so go make a cup of tea or something.
Yeah, I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody because I've got to go and try and find a spare wheel for a vehicle I need to borrow.
Okay, see you.
Unless somebody wants to lend me a car. All right then. See you all later.
Bye.
Ian,
Yeah.
do you want me to actually, because I've got the I went to America and I got the rear liners to the back of my car.
Yeah.
They kind of protect all the ends. Do you want me to go try and, I might go big wheel and go live with that?
Yeah, you can do that. We'll do that after if you want.
Or
whatever time suits you. We'll just take a video and we'll post it.
Okay, yeah, I could do that with my GoPro. Because
then you can do it any time, can't you?
All his rear subframe.
Are they aftermarket ones?
No, there's a guy in America, and I've actually got his business card somewhere, he's in Canada. And what happened is he ran a company that does 3D printing and scanning. And he scanned the inside of the rear wheel arch and made up what Honda should have done originally. So it's that last bit where all the crap gets chucked up at the back and around the back of the bumper.
Yeah.
He made a panel to go in there, fit underneath. But they were still, it was over 300 quid for a couple of bits of plastic, which is an extortionate amount of money. But I was the sort of mug that bought it because I could, basically. So, but they work incredibly well because basically it stops any crap from going up around the back.
Yeah,
and,
I think I've seen them online.
Yeah, there's a guy over in another guy over in America. I think it's called Ali Parts or something, and he made a rear diffuser for the underneath the S2000, all made out of aluminium. And the combination of the two, it just seals the whole of the back end in, so you don't get any crap around the subframe or up around the back of the bumper.
Mm.
So I can show that later if you want to. I can do a video. I go for a friend of mine, Will, who's got an S2000. He's got a car lift, and we can get the car up in the air and actually just show how it all fits in. But I just looked at it as although it was expensive, I just thought it's a great investment to kind of keep everything neat and tidy under there.
Yeah, I reckon if you've got to go somewhere and get it on a ramp and everything, why don't you video it and then we'll post that video?
That's exactly it. But Will is part of the S2000 Club. He's only 20 minutes ago. Yeah, cool. I can do. That's probably...
Someone's just muted Andy. Never mind.
Where
You
did
went-
the shop go?
Sorry, Ian. That was my...
That's right, Andy Williams. You went on mute then.
Yeah, sorry. My mum was trying to get hold of me. So,
That's right.
yeah, I'll talk to Will and I'll try and get it sorted and get a video and then I'll ping it across to you.
Yeah.
Cool.
Andy Sharp's gone missing.
I think he said he was doing that while they were getting the car up.
All right, cool. Sing a song.
Oh, he's back.
Yes,
No one needs me to sing. There's enough singing from me on the quiz.
Sorry about that. Minor technical issue. We now have the car up. So can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yep,
Yeah,
right. Let's go for it.
Cool. Well, obviously, we're trying to observe social distancing as best as possible, but
I have got a long stick here.
That's another conversation for another time. So there's two parts to this. Obviously, the part we'll do at the top of the engine bay, and then a few parts underneath. It is possible to remove the front bumper with the vehicle on the ground, but being that the car S2000 is quite low anyway, you're more than likely going to struggle getting to fixing underneath. Another thing that's worth mentioning is one of Andy's small modifications has been to change a couple of fixings along the way to aftermarket or non-standard ones. That doesn't change anything, just apart from the tool you use, but I will still point out the common issues with doing this job as if they were standard fixings, because unsurprisingly, some of the ones that Andy's replaced are absolute bastards to get loose. So to start with, I don't know if you can see that all right. So along the top here, you may or may not wish to remove this piece. You don't have to, but it is easier to do so. And the reason, and I'll explain why later on. But what you'll find here, Andy's got some aftermarket ones, so Allen headed screws with sort of a larger recessed washer, which is absolutely fine. Honda OEM runs a broad-headed Phillips head screw with a larger shank in it. That, because of the design of this bumper, water falls on it and it will sit and fall around it. I don't think I've ever come across an S2000 they aren't corroded in on. So when you come to loosen them, as said before, get some penetrating oil on them a few days beforehand. Just give yourself a slightly easier time. when you come to undo them, get a correctly fitting Phillips-headed screwdriver. If you use an ill-fitting one, you will almost certainly round them out and basically cam out, so you can't undo it, which you really want to avoid if you can. That happens, then you're into the other engineering fixes. You're going to have to drill them out. You're going to have to I'm trying to scare you, but that is something that does seem to happen with these. So if you can, penetrating oil and then a correct fitting Phillips head screwdriver, quite a broad head. Like I said, you don't have to remove this, but it's a lot easier to do so because for some of the other fixings that you need to get to. So that's the main bit up here to be aware of. Apart from that, in here, behind these rubber, this rubber weather strip, you'll find a 10mm bolt, or 10mm head, and one on the other side as well. So that's really the main part of things that you need to remove for this area. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those, and then we'll move to the other parts to be aware of. So bear with me just a second.
So when I took these bolts out, they were really badly corroded. And as Dan said, this piece along here, I ended up having to get repainted afterwards, but it's not a huge job.
Yeah, I've had to replace mine, so mine's free, but my friend's S2000 was absolutely solid. He had to drill them out.
Yeah, I drilled out, I think, 2 of mine in the end.
It's very common, to be perfectly honest.
Dan got quite upset with me because they were held together with cable ties for quite some time.
Cable ties are not a fix.
Cable ties are a great fix, Dan. Right.
So this is where we find out how tight Andy did them up last time. One thing is probably worth mentioning, like a lot of these type of videos go, disclaimer, this is the way I do it. This is what I've learned to do, and I did used to work in the trade in a past life, so I am somewhat qualified to do this, but if you know of a better way, then by all means, I'm quite keen to learn it, or you know, please do use it. And also, I have to say this: if you happen to damage something along the way, you know, I'm not going to take liability for it. You undertake the job on it, your own responsibility. I think that's hopefully understood and fair. On the subject of tools, I'm using, you know, a few convenience ones, electronic ratchets and stuff like that, but you can do this with very basic hand tools. So this is an Allen key fixing now, but if you were doing this on your own standard car for the first time, you'd be using just a Phillips screw. Yeah. Right.
And I won't tell you what your club chairman wants you to do.
What's that? Does it involve keeping my clothes?
It involves penetration, lubes and flanges.
All of which will be used at some point today. So not well, that guy. Like I said, you don't have to take this off, but you'll find it easier. And to be honest, I don't know about you guys, but if I know I've got a damaged or defective fixing, it's worthwhile fixing while you're taking the bumper off. It's a lot easier to get to things with the bumper off than trying to repair it in situ if you do find you have stuck one. So if you do, you still get the bumper off, but do take the time at that point to fix, you know, the seize bolts and get them out in some way. So I feel from this is one of Andy's bodges in here, isn't it? Is this one of your blue tack bodges?
No, that actually is a bolt in there. Ah, it might have. I might have actually put a nut on the other side. Yeah,
he has. So this isn't standard. Andy's, for whatever reason, chosen to put a nut on the back, or maybe I did it. I have to take the blame for that, I think. Nevertheless, it has a 6mm, 10mm nut on the back. So something to be aware of. I'm guessing that means that thread.
I think that thread was completely gone. Yeah.
So yes, so with those loose, you can take the strip off. Will come off. It just sort of, the rubber forms a bit of a seal. There's. Okay. And you can already see we drove the car in the rain this morning. That moisture is sitting on the threads, and it won't do them any good.
So I'll just show you where that 10mm bolt is again. It's just on the side there.
Right, so I'm just going to remove, as Andy just pointed out, there is a bolt in here to remove. Get that out of there. Do try not to drop it along the way if you can. A magnet comes in handy.
Do them bolts rust in, or they're usually all right?
Say again?
Do those bolts usually rust in, or are they okay?
These ones are usually okay. The bracket that they're going into is quite well shielded from weather. Just a side note, generally you'll find steel bolts on holding all the fixings together, but they occasionally go into aluminium sections. The timing chain section is one good example where we talk about the heat thing. Where you've got steel bolts going into steel bolts, corrosion is steel bolts going to steel threads, pardon me, corrosion is the main issue, but only if the area is exposed to moisture and salt and so on. You'll kind of see the cavity afterwards. It's fairly well shielded by both that rubber strip and just by the nature of being behind the curvature of the bumper anyway. So I haven't found those to be a problem, but don't use, if you're not sure if you're tackling it for the first time or if you have sort of more conventional hand tools, you'll feel it. It's a very difficult thing to describe, but if you've ever done any amount of spannering before, you can feel when a bolt isn't right when you're undoing it. There's a resistance which isn't in proportion to how it should do. It's at that point, more lubrication, penetration spray, not flanges yet, work the bolt back a bit, tighten it, and basically spend an extra minute working a bolt out rather than just going for it, snapping it off, and then you've got to try and drill it out. And it's easier to get the fixing out in one if you can. I don't know if that resonates with any of your experiences.
It does. I usually find tightening it first usually cracks off the rust.
Right, that's as much as we want to do at this section here. So we'll do one of the arches. So we need to do both.
Right. Yeah. Can we bring some lighting into this one?
Yeah, we can use mine or yours.
Yeah, have you got light?
Yeah, I've got
yeah. So Dan, do we need to take the wheels off to do this?
You don't. If you're holding it off, hang on to that, and I'll put another one down. Not yet, no. Right. Know how adequately lit that is. So now we're in the arch again. Like I said earlier, you can do this from foot with the car on the ground, but you will find it a bit more difficult because the wheel will, of course, be a little more compressed in the arch. Up here, the only fixing we're trying to remove here is you'll find on a standard car, you'll find an 8mm headed bolt. You can undo it with a Phillips if it's the standard fixing, but a hex drive 8mm socket will have a much better purchase, particularly if there's a little corrosion around it. This screw actually goes into a plastic tab, which is locked. It's captive in the wing, so you don't tend to find this bolt is corroded unless there was something wrong with it to start with. I'm going to go get that socket.
Isn't this much better than wheeler dealers?
But the thing is, they cut so much out of it, you wouldn't really know what they've done.
Well, exactly, yeah. So obviously we're doing this in real time, so it's taking a little bit longer.
Yeah. And also, no one's done Mike Brewer's Cockney accent yet, so it's not quite authentic. But have you got non-standard fixings, Mr. Shaw? Yes, I think you have. Can I borrow that light a moment, please?
Yeah.
Okay, take my word for it, guys. This would be an 8mm bolt normally, but for some reason, it's gone off the market.
Wouldn't be me. Although this wing was replaced following an accident, so
okay,
it might well have been happened then, perhaps.
On this particular version, it's now a 10mm bolt, but the point still stands, hopefully. So, and he's going to do a bit later on how not to have an accident in the S2000. I suspect.
Don't say that.
Yeah, that's not a happy feeling bolt. So it might come back. I mean, it's turning, but I suspect it's just turning in there. So this is what doesn't happen on wheeler dealers. Yeah, we'll come back to that one. So it feels to me like it's basically been over tightened and it's now probably holding onto the plastic. So I'll probably need to lever it out with apply a little leverage with something, a flat object, a screwdriver, whilst turning the bolt head. So we'll do the other side and see if that one comes out. For the purposes of this exercise, it's a matter of removing the bolt. So we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
I'm just going to go around the other way, Dan, so we can keep social distance.
We did the repair.
Am I allowed to mention particular? Trouble is, when you get these repairs done, particularly when I had it done, it was obviously through the insurance company, and they have their preferred repairers. This was a company in Aldershot, I believe. And one of the things that I did find out pretty quickly after they'd done it was that they'd left lots of bits of the door behind the door card out that were rattling around in the bottom of the door.
Nice.
And they'd only actually held one of the wing mirrors on with 2 bolts as well.
I have had a similarly bad experience with insurance repairers.
I do have experience insurance, fortunately. But yes.
Yes.
But back then, it wasn't insured with my company, unfortunately.
Oh dear. So this is the aforementioned fixing. Again, I have no idea if this is focusing particularly well or not, but yeah, it's just, it has a Phillips head insert on the top, and it's an 8mm. This is the normal fixing. So what we have on the other side is something else. So we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I will now go underneath the car as best as I can, you know, whether I take the phone or something and try and show you the key points. I mean, you don't necessarily need to see me removing them. I'll show you what to remove, and I'll try and do what I can with the 2 hands that I have.
So. Well, you stand there. I'll come in from the other side and see if I can get underneath. And try and show where you are.
All right.
Yeah. Which side are you going to do first?
Well, I come in.
Okay. So if I come in from the front here, and we can try and show what's under there, and you can just grab this.
This assumes, of course, that you have the same type of fixing.
Yeah.
You all right?
What's the lighting like there for everyone underneath? Can you see that okay?
Can anyone see?
Yep.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good.
Right. So, again, not the easiest to show, but in Andy's specific example, this, if you hadn't worked out, is not a Honda standard fixing.
That is a cable tie.
That is a cable tie. So rather than using sockets and screwdrivers and so on and so forth, what we're going to use to remove that is a pair of side cutters.
So there is a reason for that, is because I do have a brand new under tray, but I just haven't fitted it yet. This is the other one.
Yeah.
So
that's his excuse at any rate. So I guess we'll have to go with it. So what you'd normally find all the way along here, I don't know where you can see it, is yet more 10mm bolts. But because of the same reasons we mentioned at the top, the thread is unfortunately sitting in water, sometimes salty in this country, it's corroded. Now, these are the fixings you'd go to undo, and you'd find them very tight. And once we get the bumper off, I'll show you what's left behind of the sections that start to twist and can eventually tear out. But these have been replaced with yet more Allen-headed bolts and cable ties. So I think we should just be a matter of whipping those out, and then we're okay. So bear with me a second. I will be back.
it's going to come out from under there just to adjust the fact.
Is it just me, or we keep losing the picture from them, or is it just mine?
Oh, sorry, yeah, that was me.
Okay, cool.
Right, we're just waiting for Dan just to grab a couple of tools, and we'll be underway.
All right. So no real
Andy Williams.
Yeah,
I think it might be yours because your picture is going on and off and on and off and on and off.
Yeah, I'm on the iPad. I'm wondering whether that's the problem. Actually, I might just go.
Yeah, probably. Yeah,
okay, so
click off it and go on.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be back.
It's okay for everybody else, is it?
Perfect, guys. Yeah, really good.
Brilliant.
Right. So yeah, no real tricks to this. I'm going to go around every fixing underneath the bumper that's on the bumper itself, specifically not on the under tray. I'm going to remove because unsurprisingly that's what's holding it, holding the two parts together. So if your car's not been messed with, you'll find these are 10mm headed bolts, and be sympathetic when you try and undo them. You might be lucky, but you know, that's I can't promise that. So let's take these screws out and see where we go from there. When did you put these in?
They've been in there about a year and a half.
Yeah.
Are they coming out okay?
Hey, so far, yeah. We'll come to this part when we do the reassembly, or at least putting the bumper back on, if that's something you particularly want to see. But at that point, grease, particularly copper grease or anti-seize grease, is an absolute blessing. Because when you ever come to do this again, you won't have any of the worries with it being stuck in place. So.
You might have seen there quite a bit of water come out there when Dan undid that last bolt. Yeah, it does get back down there, doesn't it?
It's perfectly normal, but yeah, it's. I think I don't know how far these videos will end up in the big wide world of the internet, but for anyone in a climate where they don't salt the roads and don't have to worry about this sort of thing, first of all, I hate you, but second of all, it means you probably won't have any of these kind of issues. So. Even your cables.
Not too bad, is it?
No, I mean, considering the amount of moisture that's on there, that's if you use the correct grade of bolt. Where did you get them from?
eBay.
Okay, eBay's come good. I think Andy's missing some fixings, it's worth mentioning. There would be a few more there, but that, I think, basically, give a little sense check to yourself. If the bumper feels free, like it can be pulled away from the plastic under tray, then you've probably taken them all out. Again, on a standard car, it'd be very obvious, but Andy did have a couple missing, it's worth mentioning. So I've still got that little bundle of joy up there to fix, so you really have nothing else to do on your Saturday, you're more than welcome to watch me do it. But it's a problem you might encounter, so maybe it will be better.
Yeah, maybe I'll film you doing it, so at least others can see a potential solution if they have the same issue.
For a little more access, it's sometimes prudent to remove a wheel. So I think I'm going to do that in this case, just so I can show you exactly what the problem is and what the solution is. So you're looking, wheel nut key is in the boot.
It is, yeah, it's on the under tray, just underneath.
Okay.
Yeah, keys are on.
In your under
the under tray, yeah.
Under the under toe.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, just check it down there. There it is. Dan's just grabbing some tools, and we're good to go in a moment. Yeah. Now, this is a tool I wish I possessed, as you'll see in a moment.
It's this is when everything goes wrong, you need this tool. We're not going to make a Formula One pit team, but it is still quicker than using random tools. Right, now let's see.
Just whilst you're doing that, if you...
Yeah, go on.
If there was an OEM front, if there was an OEM front splitter attached, would that come off with the bumper, or does that have to be removed independently?
If it's OEM, as in a Honda one, it will come off with the bumper. The fixings go through it basically, and it depends. This is a pre-facelift car, so it has the slightly different bumper, but you'll find that there will be two fixings in the inner part of the arch, and then underneath the original bolt holes should all line up. Not always true with the aftermarket ones. Some of the polyurethane ones, the body shop or whoever fits it for you sometimes has to make their own fixings under there, if that answers your question.
You'll see on there a top tip from Ronald on the chat there. Removed and replaced all of these fittings, front and rear, including the screws, the plastic protection inside rear arches before getting underbody protection done. Makes it easier for them as removal is easy. So thank you for that, Ronald.
Good advice. Right, again, socially distancing is not going to make this very easy, but if you have a stuck fixing, again, I'm not sure what you can see, but we have this bolt up right here. It's a non-standard bolt, but that doesn't really matter. And it's threaded into a plastic expanding tab. And from a couple of different reasons, but the most common one, and the one I suspect we have here, is it's basically just been over-tightened. Now, a steel bolt is harder than a plastic expanding tab for obvious reasons. So as soon as that happens, the thread basically crushes itself into one. And as you try and undo it, it won't unwind off the fixing. You'll just basically spend the rest of your days turning the bolt, which is no use doing that. So depending on how brutal you want to be, you could get grips on it and just wrench it out. There's a few different ways you can do it, but I'm going to try and be sympathetic and try and offer some sort of leverage under the bolt. So as you undo it, you're sort of pulling it down, and it will give it a new ability for the thread to turn on the plastic. That's the plan. They don't always go to plan, but I'm just going to grab a small flat screwdriver and just see what we can do. And this doesn't.
Andy Williams, is that a late breakfast or an early lunch? I can't hear his response.
What is he eating?
Who's eating?
Maybe it's second breakfast.
I think Mariam's joined us. Hi, Mariam.
Mariam, 1 second.
I think she is. Mariam, pay attention. I might have you doing this in a couple of weeks.
I'm really sorry, guys. You're just going to get a fetching view of the back of my head. I know it's lovely, but
I'm just wondering if I can come from that direction.
It's
no, okay. Sorry, guys. No, we're not going to get in there.
Bear with me a minute, but very simply, there's a washer around the bolt. I'm just trying to get the screwdriver in there, levering it down as I undo the bolt, and it will hopefully come out in one. But if you hear some bad language, it's Andy, not me.
Late breakfast, Ian.
Ian, how long have we got on this? What time do we need to be wrapping up?
We've got as long as you want, really.
Okay.
We'll keep going until 1 o'clock.
Okay.
But if we want to do more, we can do more. We're flexible and fluid.
Yeah.
The only other stuff we've got to do today is just to stream people's videos and pictures and stuff that they've sent in. So if people are interested in this carrying on, more than happy for it to carry on, and we can post pictures and videos that,
yeah.
Simultaneously. So yeah, cool.
So I think we're quite happy to carry on, aren't we, Dan? Till everyone's done.
I can make a front bumper removal after the weekend if you want. But, probably don't want that.
It's worth mentioning that all the bushes are replaced on this car. That's not an easy job to do, is it, Dan?
No, that was something else I probably should have mentioned. If I can talk you through what's involved and how to even check them yourself if you want. Andy says he's got replacement ones, so they're not seized. We did that 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
But if you want to know what you're looking for and how to tell if you've got a problem waiting, then I can gladly show you under the car where to check them and what to look for.
Right, maybe we'll do that after we've got the bumper off.
Yeah.
Did you replace them with OEM or a different brand?
Polybush.
With Polybush. Shifting.
It is. The problem you have.
You can get Mugen Polybushes, or you can get something like Powerflex or Spoon. So most of the guys make them.
Yeah, these were just Polybush ones, which, as you say, the hardness differs for the polyurethane, but they fundamentally do the same thing. There's some discussion about whether they're better or longer lasting in terms of compliance and whether you have to maintain them with grease and so on. But you know, there's fors and against, like all modifications. So.
Yeah, I'd heard somewhere that somebody's had experience with cracking of the chassis with polybush if you're, doing a lot of track days.
Yeah, I'd say it's possible. You might find that to be more true if something was rose jointed, so no bushing at all, is welded close. But there's no denying they do transmit more NVH, noise, vibration, and harshness through the chassis. So yeah, it's something to consider. You can also get solid subframe mounts like collars. I've heard that they can do the same thing, but I've not seen it. I've fitted some, but I've not seen it. So it's
with the spoon, it's just very slightly, because I think Mugen did a set of bushes as well, and it's kind of it's trying to find the right variant really for just road use. And what would be your advice? Would you try and go OEM, or have they completely stopped making them?
You can't buy OEM bushes separately. They only sell them with the arms, so it's very, very expensive.
Right, okay.
So they don't sell them as separate units. So Mugen do a kit which is they're a similar softness. They're rubber rather than poly. Right. But Hendy does them, and he knows all the parts. So I've replaced mine with Mugen, and they've got a kit. There's just one bush that they don't do in the Mugen kit, and I just put a Powerflex one in there. I can't remember which one it is, but Cy at Hendy knows all of that stuff.
Okay, because it's like I've got to take the rear end off and do that at some point. So I think it's the shim collar set you're talking about. I've seen those and worked with them. So all they do is just locate the holes between the chassis and the subframe. So there's no slip in it, or no wobble, should you say? I actually think it's more down to the geometry. You can get it more accurate.
Another joy of the S2000 or Hondas in general are these little plastic tabs, which if they've not had a lot of love over time, they just become brittle and snap. I actually keep spares in the garage, so if you want to get some, you can get them off eBay, but they become so brittle and crusty that they just don't come out basically. So
again, I managed to get a whole set of these off eBay. Came in a box with about 200 different clips. And yeah, they do break quite often.
Yeah, another unfortunate side effect of our lovely climate. So. And age, to be fair. I mean, this car is sort of 17 years old.
It is, yeah. It's gone. Yeah. So it's worth mentioning this car is, as Dan says, getting on for September it'll be 18 years old, and it has done 137,000 miles now. So it's had some use.
Does anybody know what kind of the longevity of the engine is at all?
My best understanding of it is there's cars in America that because they just have much more land mass and they don't seem to be so hung up on mileage as British people seem to. There are some 200 and possibly even I think 300,000 mile original F20s on there.
Wow.
But my own car, I supercharged it. I'm on 123,000 miles, and mine's supercharged. Has been for a couple of years, and I'm sympathetic to it. I warm it up, so on and so forth. But I do also drive it like it's supposed to. And touch wood, this would be the ultimate jinx now. But compression figures are good. The oil that comes out of it is healthy in colour. There's no particulate, anything like that. If you're sympathetic, keep an eye on your oil and keep an eye on your maintenance. They do really last for a long time. K's and F series engines that what you find most commonly on the road today, they go on for hundreds of thousands of miles. That's my understanding.
Excellent, thank you for that. So there's a product I came across called ZX1, which I kind of swear by. I think it's a brilliant product. It's like an additive, but it's an oil additive, not like the old Slick 50 scenario. And it's basically, I think the website is www.zx1sport. So that might be something for people to have a look at, because it just kind of takes all the friction out and just makes everything, it's very, very subtle, but it just makes everything just, the best way to describe it, if you're going, kind of along the road and you just take your foot off the accelerator, whereas you get it just keeps going. So, and I've done engine, gearbox, back differential.
All right, take two.
Dan's just put a spanner on the other side of that.
Yeah, I'm basically just going to press a spanner over the fixing to see if I can get any kind of counter hold, but it is going, but it's rough, basically. I think that is going to, yeah, that's nearly out.
Success.
It's out. Right, which means, after a swift 10 or 15 minute pause, sorry about that, we're now ready to take the bumper off. Now, I've got a rubber textured floor in here for if you spill anything or, you know, it's easier to keep clean. So when I take the bumper off, we'll lay it down on it. When you lay the bumper as it sits, as it would be on the car, vertically, all it wants to do is fall forward, which is obviously going to mark your paintwork. So what you tend to do is, or it's easier to do, is to lay it on its back. So you'll be laying it on this corner and this corner. Now on a rubber finish like this, there's no problem. But if you're working outside or in stones or in gravel or something like that, just stick a mat down or formats, some towels or something like that. Otherwise, you know, if you take paint off the corners, it would bother my OCD. Whether it bother yours or not is totally up to you. Right. So with those fixings out, so the two uprights in either wheel arch, all the fixings along the bottom, and where we started at the top with that strip and the two 10mm, this should be ready to come off. It's always entertaining when you get to at this point, particularly for the car, you've not had the car since it was new, and you find other fixings along the way that other body shops or any previous owners have put in there. But if there aren't any, that is the minimum that you need to remove. The only thing you need to be aware of is if you still have functioning headlight washers. So all UK cars do have these, but the JDMs don't. So as you pull the bumper forward, there is some piping that runs behind the bumper that connects to the headlight. You're going to have to, I'll show you how, but you're going to have to remove that. Some cars have daytime, sort of owner-fitted daytime running lights. So, you know, if you put those in, you're obviously going to know they're there. But if you didn't, there will unsurprisingly be wiring for those as well. So Andy only has the headlight washer part. So let's see what happens.
2 minutes off?
It can be.
Yeah. So I'm just going to put the camera down for a moment while I just head down off with that.
I don't know if you can see. Focus on this bit if you can.
Can we come in here, maybe?
The bumper itself, it's hard to describe, but when you come to take it off, the bumper itself is kind of hooked behind the arches, so that it kind of comes round like this. So you can't just pull it straight forward off the car. Let me do it one man. If you want to film that, let me do it one man.
You sure?
Yeah. So if you just pull forward, you'll find it doesn't want to come. The main brackets that are holding it are just behind this section here, and they press into place. So what you actually need to do is get them forward, get them out and forward and away from it. It feels a bit rough. It feels like you're going to damage it, but you shouldn't do if you have a degree of finesse in your hands. One thing that is worth thinking about is whether you're doing this on a warm day or a cold day. If it's very, very cold, if you're doing this in the winter time, plastic is more brittle. You do run a greater risk of something snapping on you. Today, it's an English summer day, so it's about 20 degrees and raining. So it's warm in here. There's no reason that the plastic wouldn't be as malleable as it needs to be. So all I tend to do is obviously make sure it's free at the top, and make sure it's free here, and just try and work it free. Butter the hand sometimes works. Again, it looks a bit brutal, but it isn't.
There we go.
Like that. That's one. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. But as I pull the bumper forward, we've got these headlight washer connections that I spoke about earlier. That's when I'll probably need Andy's help because I only have 2 pairs of hands.
I'm just going to go around the other side of the car so we can just keep our distance.
I would do the same thing this side. I tend to, this is just a little tip I've picked up along the way, I tend to keep trying, I've got quite long arms and legs, so I'm fortunate, but keep my leg around somewhere here. So if you do put it forward, it doesn't just fall straight off the car. You've got some degree of control on it. But 2 people is a lot better, for sure. So same again, nothing special. Like that. Now that should come forward. If there's been no funny business with other fixings and screws, this should be just coming up now. As you do, take the bumper off, try not to tip it forward. Reason being is this will obviously come up. and you don't want it to rub or touch on your wings if you can avoid it. If you have the tools or the time or the interest, you could put something over it, cloths or newspaper or something like that. I'm going to pull the bumper forward, see how easy it is to come through, which is pretty easy. Good. Right, so what we have now is a job for Andy, which is where we just need to unplug the headlight washers. We only need to do 2 clips. It's been a while actually since I've done a car with headlight washers because mine doesn't have them. So all we're going to do really is disconnect here. It's just a pinch clip, and then the same on the other side. As you pull it loose, you will lose a little bit of screen wash. It's the same reservoir as your headlight washers, but you won't lose loads. You lose a little bit, but you won't lose loads. So I'll try and do it one-handed, but it may not work. So it depends how often it's been on.
There we go.
There we go.
That's clear.
That's one. Let's see what a little bit of coolant looks like. See if I'm right. It's okay.
Right.
Coolant, sorry, screen wash is what I mean.
I've got hold of the other side here.
Same on the other side. Nothing tricky.
In there to show everyone which one you do.
Yeah, I'm just a simple pinch clip. Put down the rubber, and it should just come free.
There we go. Bumper is off.
That's a bumper off. So we've got a little bit more screen wash, but anyway. Right, and as I said earlier, these are the corners you want to put it down on. If I just put it on the ground now, I'll show you what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's going to be tricky for me to get all this in, but
yeah.
There you go.
So if you just put it down like this, it has a tendency, although it's behaving itself now, it doesn't take much for it to just sort of fall forward. So what I tend to do is when you have a correct surface to put it on, just lay it on the back, or the back as it were. So, and that's a bumper taken off.
Good. Should we have a quick scoot round to see what's underneath?
Yeah, while we're here, what do you want to see?
So, as you can see, quite a lot of leaf litter in here. I'll just remove.
There is one thing we can talk about while we're here.
Okay.
And that's the secondary air pump.
Secondary air pump.
It's probably worth a conversation. So, with the bumper off, obviously it depends what you want to do or what you're trying to achieve. Lip fitting, or you might be smoothing bits off, might be for paintwork. One of the things you might end up doing while you're in this neck of the woods. I'll show you.
Yep.
As best as we can.
Yep.
So if you haven't seen it before, this is the secondary air pump or the auxiliary air pump.
Talking about there.
This main part here.
Yep.
But all of this gubbins is related to it. So without going into masses of detail, when you start up your car, this runs for a period of time. It takes air from the filtered side. On your standard car, there'll be an airbox here, but it's the same principle. Takes filtered air from here, puts it through a pump, sends it back up through, where's this other pipe? It's difficult to show you. But the other pipe basically runs underneath and alongside. It's this one here, the one I've got my finger on now.
See if I can get in there. Sorry, it might be a bit upside down here.
It's very upside down. Yeah, you're kind of showing it. So this is the air in pipe, and this is the air out pipe, this one here. And that finds its way along the side of the engine bay, whether you want to show it or not. And it actually comes out into this thing here, which is the secondary air inlet valve. This is what actually administers the air to the inlet manifold. And the reason you want that is because when the car is very, very cold, it wants to warm. You need to warm the catalytic converter quickly to lower the emissions. And fuel, petrol, despite being the combustive product, it actually cools the cylinder down, actually cools the mixture down. So what this does is it lets excessive or overly lean quantities. It makes the cylinder condition overly lean with over quantities of air, and that actually warms up the cylinders and actually warms up the cat more quickly, so that the emissions at the exhaust are lower. Which works fine most of the time. You can actually hear it, particularly if you run an aftermarket intake like Andy's got. You can actually hear when it's running or not. It makes a more distinctive whining noise that cuts off after 20, 30 seconds, depending on the ambient temperature. Now, what can happen is either a relay can fail, specifically in this area, and the pump will stop working completely. Or if you have excessive moisture in the air, the inside of the pump itself can fail. And then the bearings can go, or it seizes. The net result is, if if there isn't the correct volume of air on and the correct operation electronically from the pump, you'll get an engine warning light on with a very specific code. At that point, you can either expensively replace all of this or put together or buy any of the pre-made kits that take them out. Delta Lima sounds familiar. I think it's one of the forum members from the Netherlands, I think, who has made a basically a consolidated kit you can buy with resistors and blanking plates and all the other things you need to take this out. You don't need it. You'll still pass an emissions check in the MOT without it. All you would need to do is be aware that if your car was parked at, say, an MOT test centre and they moved it very quickly from a car park straight into the emissions test, which they wouldn't normally do, by the way, you might not pass that because the cat may not be up to temperature. So if that is a consideration, the best thing to do is on your way to the test centre before your appointment is do an Italian tune-up and give the car a few revs, and that will warm the whole exhaust system and especially the cat thoroughly, and you shouldn't have any problems with emissions. If you're running a DCAT, which some of us are, this is a non-issue. So this really is not necessary at all. Mentioned all of this only because it's one of the most common things to do when you take the bumper off. You can get to it from just taking the wheel arch out, but if you can imagine the access you'd have here with a bumper in place, it's much more limited. It's a lot easier to take the bumper out. That's probably...
Andy, are there any advantages of not having it performance-wise or not? Does it make no difference at all?
Makes absolutely no difference at all while the car's running. It's purely a secondary air handling device to manage emissions. The performance of the car is unaffected. And actually, when you use an amount of throttle up here with this valve, when you throttle, this valve moves. There's a small piston, a plunger inside, which closes off. So this has absolutely no effect on performance. It's eventually will just fail. So no, if you have that code, by all means, buy one of the kits. You can remove it without consequence. You can put the parts of the kit together yourself. They're not expensive, but if you don't want the hassle, it's I think it's Delta Lima is one of the sellers has already made it easy for you. So
brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, again, there's not too much more to show you. If you were checking the car and when you got to the stage, something you might want to have a quick look at. It's a lot easier to see with no bumper on. This is a good example of the tabs we're talking about. So this is this one here, not the leaf, that's something else. This is a spire clip that I was mentioning earlier.
I'll come around the other way.
We do one there. Do one there.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, social distancing.
Yeah.
So this is a spire clip. Hopefully you can see it there. Very, very simple. Just has a hole in the bottom, dear Liza, and a threaded insert up here. So this is what the bolt that we took out earlier just screws into. Now, Honda's ones are, as they get a little bit older and they corrode. I think that one is, oh no, they're all okay. No, these ones are obviously zinc plated or properly coated, so they should last a little bit longer. But here lies where an old one used to be. And this is actually split here, as you can see. So what will have happened is when someone's tried to remove this, you just turn it and the whole clip, the whole one of those silver spire clips just twists. And it basically just rips the plastic apart. That's what you're up against when you're trying to do this for the first time, particularly if your bumper's not been off in your ownership. So it's just something to be aware of. You might also want to have a quick look under here. On a standard S2000, the cooling section is stacked. So at the front, you have your air conditioning condenser. It's a radiator for all intents and purposes. And behind it, you have the water or the engine's coolant radiator, which you can see a lot more from the engine bay. Now, off the top of my head, we replaced this a couple of years ago.
3 years ago.
About 3 years ago. Very, very common that you'll find that these fins will split and they'll start to sag and fall down. Some people even find, the remnants of it laying on this part of the tray when they come out.
I think when we took it out, there was probably about a third of the fins left.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things. So the air conditioning refrigerant passes through the channels, but it puts out its heat basically through these small fins. And because of the design of them and the nature of what they have to put up with being hit with incoming moisture and grit and stones and all the other things, they do eventually just break up. So if you haven't ever changed this, and yours is still in good nick, you're probably doing pretty well. And then further at the back, this is also an aftermarket radiator, although it's designed to look like a standard one. No reason why you shouldn't go aftermarket. The Honda OEM ones are very expensive. I tend to get them from a website called carcooling.co.uk, I think. Very, very affordable for both. The aircon condenser and the water rad together are about 120 or 130 pounds. And the last time I checked, I think just the Honda water radiator on its own from the main dealer was, I think, over 300 quid. It's a Denso item. It's a good quality item, don't get me wrong, but the economics of replacing OEM items at this age of car, you know, you have to make that decision.
Is it possible to get a refurbed one, Dan?
You could get a refurbished core, but it's probably not worth it for the cost. That's the issue.
Okay.
Separating the plastic end tanks away from the metal cooling structure in the middle, it might be possible, but it's probably not worth it. The only time you tend to need any more than the OEM cooling is when you go down the forced induction route, and that's actually a project I'm well embroiled in with my own car at the moment. Since being supercharged, it's very reliable in temperature management wise, but in the most extremes it sees, I think last year we went to Castle Coombe there was I forget, it was one of the Japanese car mixers. We were able to do some track time, and it was absolutely baking hot. And the engine was just running warmer than I wanted. So I was already running an aftermarket radiator, but now I've moved more into thinking about the type of fans I have, the ducting and the ventilation at the front, and changing the oil cooler and other things. But for a factory road car, this should be all you'd ever need, certainly in this country at least. Anything else to show?
No. While we've got the wheel off, should we have a look at the bushings?
Yeah. Just, you guys want to see? Do you want to have a look at the suspension bushings?
Just to show you how to check them.
Yeah, go on then.
Yep.
We've got a message on YouTube live on the YouTube channel from Dorset Scousers Garage.
Yeah. Okay.
So he's an S2000 owner. He got a yellow one, I think, and he does loads of videos on YouTube. Hello from Dorset. My S2000 is in for an engine rebuild at the moment. Can't wait to get it back to work on a few little projects myself. He hasn't asked a question. He's just written that.
All right.
Okay. Good luck. Engine rebuilds, fairly uncommon. You're unlucky with S2000s. I think it's unless you have a problem you didn't notice. You cracked a sump. You have a massive oil leak you didn't get on top of, or it overheats. Or if you modify it. So modifying is the work of the devil, as I'm sure Andrew's now figured out. So.
Yep.
All right.
Right. So
have a look at the bushings in each. So we'll cover the front bushings first, because that's where we are, unsurprisingly.
Just bear with me a second. I'll just make an adjustment on the selfie stick. Okay.
We okay? We still recording? Right. So on the front of an S2000, let's say there's some slightly aftermarket things going on here. I'll point them out just for reference. So Andy has aftermarket braided brake lines to replace the OEM rubber ones. Andy has what looks like some very Japanese domestic market spiders in this neck of the woods. They're not standard, but you might have them as well. But underneath those spiders is a Mr. R Zeta R, I think, coilover. We can talk about modifications later if you want to, but if you don't have this in its place, you'll find the Honda OEM Showa strut, which is very good. It's very, very good for road use. If you don't do any track days in it, you possibly wouldn't need any more, unless it gets too old and tired and starts to leak, or your spring was corroded or whatever. Some people don't change them, and they are perfectly fine. And the other thing you might see here, under a little bit of dirt, are the red parts, which are the replacement bushes. So on the front suspension, or the front end, should I say, of an S2000, yeah, can you?
Yeah, that's fine. I got that. Yeah.
You have 3 suspension adjustment points, one of which is the steering rack, and 2 are the bushes you see here. Here's this one here is the caster or compliance bush, and this one here, I don't know if Andy can get to it. I don't know if we're able to look at it, or maybe go higher.
Yeah, if you bring the light in the other side.
Is that any easier?
I think we can see that. Can you see that there, just behind the...
Where my hand
line,
is?
Yeah,
this part here. So this is the camber bush. So if you pan out for a moment, just for anyone who's not familiar. So if we look at this wheel hub in relation to the rest of the car, camber is the tilt on the wheel. So if my hand is the wheel, if you have negative camber, that means the top is pulled in. By definition, the bottom is pulled out. So if you have positive camber, that means the top is pulled out and therefore the bottom is pulled in. So that has a number of different dynamic effects depending on whether you're concerned with straight line stability, cornering, turning, so on and so forth. What should be noted is on a normal road car, if you run excessive amounts of camber, you can expect to find increased tyre wear. So if we have a quick look at Andy's car, Andy, if I remember correctly, you're running most OEM settings, I think, aren't you?
Yes, the fast road settings.
Yeah, you can actually see. I've got a tyre depth gauge in the toolbox. We don't really need it. I can tell you there's ever so slightly more wear on the inside of the tyre than there is on the outside. Not unexpected. And the other thing you have to remember in the UK, of course, we go around roundabouts and things as we're turning right. So generally speaking, you can expect the passenger side or the near side tyre to be under load a bit more. I mean, I won't measure your tyres now, but camber, if Andy was running excessive negative camber, as in the bottom of the tyre was more out, you would expect to find this part more worn. Positive camber, you'd expect to find this part more worn. And if it's somewhere corrected in the middle, you would find even wear over the top of it. Don't confuse that with the tyre pressure where you can see as well. For instance, an overinflated tyre or an underinflated tyre. That can confuse things as well. But assuming that your tyres are correctly inflated, if you have excessive shoulder wear, it's most commonly down to camber. There is an aspect of steering as well, which we need to talk about now. So just something to be aware of if you've not looked at it in this level of detail. So as we said earlier, this bush here at the front, if you can see it, this is your camber bush. So what you'll find here is on one end, a 17mm headed nut, and at the other end, a 17mm headed bolt. And to make it easy, I'm just going to go and grab one from the toolbox, and I'll show you what I'm working on.
What do you need?
I was going to show you that camber bolt so you can see. We'll come back to it. I had some camber bolts in a bag somewhere, but for whatever reason I can't find them. If I find them, I'll carry on and show you. So, let's grab that. Yeah, you got it. Right. So Ed, as I was saying, on this part here, you'll find a 17mm nut on the left-hand side there, where my finger is. And on the other end, other side, you'll find an equivalent 17mm headed bolt. Now, if you want to come on this side, Andy, it might be if you can try and show the cam plate itself, or whatever's going to be easier. If you can see on this bolt here, it's eccentric, as in it's bigger at that bit there than it is up here. Reason being is when you've loosened the nut off and you turn this, it's like a cam, basically similar to a cam in your car. You have a ramp angle, you have a high bit and a low bit. As you turn it, you pull the wishbone in and out in relation to the car, thus adjusting the camber. So that's one thing. This is one area that is quite common to be seized. So you can find this is seized. So you'll undo the nut on one end and you'll go and turn this bolt and it won't turn at all. And the problem is if you put excessive amounts of force on it, you'll actually end up ripping the bush. You'll end up tearing the collar, the center out of the bushing, and then it's destroyed basically. As I think someone said online earlier, you can't buy OEM replacements. So at that point, you'd be buying either a new wishbone or a second-hand wishbone or so on, or you'd be going down this poly bushing route. So that's one thing to check. Again, Plus Gas, WD-40, other penetrant sprays are your friend here. So if you're thinking of tackling this job where you want to see how seized they are, get this whole area nicely soaked in whatever penetrating fluid you've got. Give it a couple of days and just see if they turn. You might be lucky. Okay, moving further backwards toward the rear of the car. This is the caster bush.
Camera position.
You're getting cozy.
I'm getting cozy here.
Right, so this is the caster bush, as I said earlier. So this is adjusted underneath. My memory fails me, but I think I'm sad enough to know, I think it's a 23mm bolt right underneath here. And if you can show it, you can get that underneath enough, maybe. Yeah. So you'll undo the center bolt, the whole bolt will drop out the middle, and then, oh, I'm lying to you, no, it's a 19mm bolt head and 21 on the outside bit. So the bolt bit itself that you take out is 19, and the bit that surrounds it, I think, is 23. You'll try and turn that, and you'll find I don't think I've come across an S2000 where that hasn't been seized. So you'll try and turn it, and it just won't go. Same problem as the camber one at the front. It's rusted into its collar, and no amount of forcing will make it work. Excuse me.
So, Dan, do you think this was kind of like a design consideration that Honda didn't have when they put the car together?
I would say it's made for a market. So a market that doesn't, and to a cost, admittedly. I do think this could have been prevented if they'd put more grease, or even any grease at all in, so a lubricating and assembly grease at the factory. Again, I've heard conflicting rumours. Some say that they did, and it's just washed and dried out over the years. It's very plausible. Some people say they didn't put any in at all. But certainly, even the youngest S2000 on our roads, in the UK roads now, is at sort of 10, 11 years old. You'd have done well if you didn't have a seized one. Let's put it that way. So no, I wouldn't say it's a design fault. It's probably just wasn't in the specification for what they thought would be a problem, 5, 10, 15, certainly 20 years down the line. So camber, just for the sake of awareness, in relation to what that does is that brings the hub and the angle either forward or back. Not as extreme as obviously as my hand is moving, but if you adjusted that, you would find it's pushing the wheel basically more towards the front of the car or the rear of the car. It has effects and impacts on steering and self-centering and the eagerness of turning and the general stability and so on and so forth. But suspension geometry is a really exacting science. There's a lot of reasons why you choose one settings over another, depending on how you use the car. Honda's factory settings, unsurprisingly, are pretty good for the road. There are differences in the years of the car. So the early cars have, I wouldn't say extreme, they have a more aggressive setting. It's a bit more twitchy, which twinned with the 16-inch wheel, the early type wheel with the slightly thinner tyres, makes for a more lively experience. And as the years went by, the suspension settings changed a bit, along with changes to the anti-roll bar. The wheels went up an inch, the tyres grew in diameter, in width. And you ended up with a more stable or a bit more relaxing kind of drive to it, alongside other things like stability control. I think was added in 2006 onwards cars, along with some other mechanical changes to the engine. So Andy's car actually represents the early type.
So there's a message from Ian on the feed here saying he's the youngest and it was seized as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Just prove your point.
No, again, it's very, very common. So the third and final adjustment in here isn't actually a bush-related one or a suspension-related one. It's actually to do with the steering. So this is the end, or the track rod end, tie rod end of the steering rack. It's actually made up of two parts. There's an inner, which is the majority of the joint is under this gaiter, which keeps grit and dirt out. And then you have this outer. I don't know how the clarity is on the camera, but you can see a little bit of thread left here. So you have this lock nut where my thumb and forefinger is now. So you'd loosen that off, and then you turn this arm here, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. And because it's threaded, it will either push the wheel out or bring the wheel in. And you can imagine that's the effect it will have on the hub of the car. That will either toe inwards, so the steering point's in, or toe outwards, so the steering point's out. You might assume that completely neutral forward-pointing wheels is always what you would want, and that would seem logical. But again, there's a number of reasons why you might want a little bit of toe out or even a little bit of toe in relation to the other suspension settings. These, I wouldn't say see, they can, because of where they sit and the life they lead, being splashed by moisture and all the road grime and everything, these can be very tight. But because it's an all-metal item, you can use a bit of heat on it, or penetrating oils and things if you come to adjust these. But unless you have the right equipment, it's very unlikely you'd get an accurate suspension alignment or a tracking toe alignment left to your own devices. You tend to need the specialist equipment that geometry places have. Hunter Hawkeye is one such piece of equipment that uses orienting lasers to basically tell you the exact position of the wheel and the settings in each corner. So yeah, shall we have a look at the back, or is there any more questions at the front?
Okay, see the back.
To the back. Okay, I need to flip the wheel off for that.
Yeah. You've got the locking nut.
Yeah, I've got should have bought a beer out here. Is it lunchtime?
It's not far off lunchtime yet.
Just a sense check. Is this relevant? Is this useful? Change it or do something else?
It's all good.
I was going to say it's very useful because it's something I've got to do. I was going to drop rear and front subframes and get them all refurbished, and it's actually nice to see the components and bits that we actually need to order and sort out. So just need to do a bit of research on which way to go with the bushes.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, if you're dropping subframes, the rear's easier than the front because obviously you don't have to support the engine, but you'll find access so much easier. I mean, one thing I haven't talked about yet is the actual method of removing these stuck bushes. Some people burn them out. You can chop them out. I tend to use a combination of both. But you'll find it so much easier off the car. Sorry, you were saying?
No, I was just going to ask what lift you're using there, actually, because what's it taking up, about 18 inches, something like that?
I haven't measured it, to be honest, but yeah, this is it's a quick jack. So you can find it on Google. It's made by, I think it's an American company called Ranger or Benpack. I forget.
Ranger products there.
Yeah, Ranger. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, I wasn't making it up. So they do 3 different flavors. They do a light car version. It's all in pounds because of America. This is I want to say 3,500. Right. Maybe 3,000. So this is the middle one. This can lift 2,268 kilos, so comfortably more than you'd need for an S2000. And yeah, just over there where the hoses are going to, that's the hydraulic unit for it. So you put a bit of automatic transmission fluid in it, and that's actually a DC unit. So you could run it off your car battery if you wanted to. I'm just using a battery charger booster pack basically, so I can run it off the main, so I don't have to keep the car battery charged. But yeah, connect up some quick release hydraulic hoses at either end, and yeah, it lifts. Yeah, it probably is. I'm not very good at distances. How tall? How high?
That's probably about 18 inches. Probably not far off, is it?
Yeah, and the thing I like about it, what's about it? You get rubber pads, which you can. I don't know if you can see. So they go between the jack and the platform itself, and you also have this security locking tab here, which is also on a cam. So basically, for it to fail simultaneously, this arm would have to completely disintegrate, and the hydraulics would have to completely fail, which could happen, but I certainly wouldn't be around to tell the tale if it did. So it feels very secure. You can sort of lock and move the car, and it is very sturdy. The only downside, and it's not a problem, it's just something to consider, is you lose access in from the side of the car, so all your entry is done from the front or rear of the car. But it's been an absolute godsend. The years I did, particularly when I lived in other houses, of sort of inching a car up on jacks diagonally and it's balancing precariously on axle stands and things, it has made it a lot easier. So yeah, I recommend it.
You could put in slightly higher rubber wedges as well. I would imagine you can get.
You can, yeah. You get. Obviously, this is a larger block for the larger car. You can actually get some for pinch welds as well. I should probably be using them for this, in all honesty. So it has a recess in it, and you can stack these. Like with my daily drivers, my tip run car is a Honda CR-V, which is obviously much taller. So you can stack them up and get it that bit higher.
Yeah.
So it's one of those tools, a bit like this impact gun, to be honest. You spend a little more, but it's worth it in the long run. So yeah, I recommend it. If you do a lot of home DIYing, it's an absolute godsend.
Can I suggest we just crack on with this bush? And the reason being is I'm down to about 15% of battery here.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't mean we can't carry on. We just need to swap over.
Yeah, fine. Yeah. What do you need? You need a funny USB.
No, I've got a charger here. Yeah. So if we just finish off this view of the bush on this phone, and then we'll probably just need to swap over then.
Yeah. And I don't know if people are still logged on and still awake.
We have still 23 people on.
I'm impressed. Okay. Let's get these.
Fantastic.
What was that?
Sorry, did someone ask a question there? Hang on, let's just get the noise out of the way. Okay, any questions there?
Right, we're good to go.
There's a lot more access here, so we should be able to get some better camera angles coming in.
Yeah. So at the back, same kind of thing, braided lines, a different suspension upright, a coilover, so Mr. O in this case. But if we look at the bushes on the back here, there's actually 3 you need to concern yourself with. So the first and foremost, this is not an adjustable bush. The wishbone is much larger on the rear, much longer. This bolt here is a 17mm head. It comes out very easily because it's not a suspension adjusting one. It just bolts straight through the subframe. You shouldn't have any problems with this. You still need to change it, obviously, if you're doing that part of the job. But it's very rare to have a problem with these Cs. Doesn't hurt to put any penetrating oil or fluid on it, just for the obvious reasons, but these don't tend to be a problem. Which brings me neatly on to this one here, which does tend to be a problem.
Let me see if I can get the camera in there a bit closer.
It's not any easier. This one here,
there we go.
That's quite good.
Yeah.
So this is the rear toe, or the toe adjustment arm and bush. There's lots of different names for this. Some people call them traction arms. I think that's possibly an American expression, but a bit like the steering at the front, this adjusts the toe on the rear hub. So the amount of pointing outward or pointing inward, toe in or toe out, that you have on the rear hub. There's, again, a lot of discussion about whether you want to poly bush this or not, or leave an OEM replacement in. You can get whole replacement arms from companies like Hard Race or Megan Racing, I think, make them. There's lots of different ones. There's probably some on eBay as well. I wouldn't want to say anything libelous, but I hear that some of the cheaper ones can be a little unreliable. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this is not a part you want to fail on you, to find that you suddenly have completely adjustable suspension at 100, 150 miles an hour if you're on a track, for instance. So if you do replace that arm, go for a good quality one. I use Hard Race. I've used Hard Race ones in the past, and touch wood, not there's any in here, they've always been okay. This one does seize very commonly. It has the same kind of adjustment as all of them. So you have a cam bolt on one end and this locking nut on the other side, 17mm here, if I'm not mistaken. So you'll loosen that nut and you'll try and turn this. And if all is working, you will, the arm will sort of come in and out slightly. At the other end of it, you won't be able to see this because of the positioning, but take my word for it. The other end of this arm is a ball joint. That's how it mounts to the hub. Even if your bush up this end isn't seized, the ball joint, all ball joints can wear, but this one can wear, and you'll find you have a bit more vague breakaway if you're often taking the car to the limit and over it to slide the car. Changing this arm for even a brand new OEM one, or especially an aftermarket one, I think can give you much improved feel just from a lack of play or slack in the arm. That one is another same job. You'd saw it out or you'd burn it out. And if you're combining it with a subframe refurbishment or removing a powder coating or something, there's probably no reason not to use heat. Just probably be conscious of the rubber items and the brake lines and things around it.
Is it worth mentioning the kind of tools you would use if you wanted to chop it out?
Yeah. We'll say we can probably do that at the end. I'll show you my my surgeon's toolkit for that. It's not just a big hammer, honestly. The third and final one on the rear, again, I don't know if I'm going to go low to see it or not.
Right down here.
Is this one here on the right at the back of the subframe. So this is the rear camber adjustment. Same kind of arrangement as normal, except you have 19mm. Oh, thank you. You're right.
Bring the light in a bit better there.
Yeah. So you have a 19mm nut on headed nut on the back, and the same size head on the bolt. Exactly the same kind of cam arrangement. I will find one of those bolts just to make it live for people. But you'd adjust that, and it will bring the, as we said before, the bottom or the hub out or in, inducing either negative or positive camber accordingly. So that's really it. I can, if needs be, go underneath the car and show you what you can see, but they're the things we're looking at. So you're looking at 2 adjustable bushes that are likely / possible to be seized at the rear, and 2 at the front. But there are 10 possible adjustments, including the steering rack at the front. And they'll all need to be free if you're going to perform a full adjustment and a line.
So Dan, if someone needs just to check whether they're seized or not, is that just a case of putting a spanner on one of them and just seeing if it turns? Yep.
Yeah. So for all of them, you'll want to loosen the locking nut, except the caster one at the front, as I said earlier. That has a bolt in the middle. So you adjust with what's on the outside, but you have to take this whole. The bolt will come out fine, and that's the misleading thing. The bolt will come out. Those nuts will come loose. And you might think to yourself, oh, this is fine, I'm not seized up at all. It's only when you try and turn the other end, the cam driving end, you'll find it doesn't go at all. If it does, you know, make hay while the sun shines, take it out, dismantle it, clean it and grease it, because you've got a free one and you want to preserve that. But as I say that, if you do have one seized bush that you really cannot get free, you can't just buy an OEM bush, and you wouldn't really want to just polybush one part of a wishbone. You'd probably want to do all of them. I would imagine. So it kind of comes to the point, if you've got a seized one, you're probably going to end up doing them all.
Folks, I'm going to have to swap phones now. I'm just about to run out of charge. If you just want to take a 2-minute break, we'll come back.
Yeah.
Once we've done that.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Right, my phone will be charged, so we'll put mine in your thing. Have you got your lead?
I have got my lead, yeah.
Okay, cheers, guys. I'm going to have to go and do some work, so it's been very informative. Thanks a lot for your time, Dan, and have a good day, and I'll try and come back in later on.
No, pleasure. Hope it's of use.
Definitely, absolutely.
See my black.
We're going to fill this up.
Yeah. So Dan's just going to go and get a drink, and then we'll be back with you very shortly. What did you do with that big black bag? It's in there. There we go. All right. We've got some power there.
People still happy to
Yeah, no, I'm happy to keep filming.
You want a drink?
No, I'm all right. Sure. Yep.
And would you do me a favour? The cartridge, there's a plastic tub.
Is there anything in particular that people would like showing?
Yeah, plastic. Yeah, that's it. And the spray lance, which is just under that block. Yeah, we'll need to put that out, and then we'll come back and she wants certain.
Get your phone up and
yeah. So just you can't lock, you know. But...
Yeah. You want me to?
Quite possibly, yeah.
Right, if I get my settings. Ian, I don't know, can you pin Dan's phone now?
People have to pin it themselves.
You need to pin on the YouTube as well, Ian. Have you done it?
Yeah, I'll pin on the YouTube.
So Ian, I'm just switching onto Dan's phone here. Are you able to pin that at all?
Yeah, done it. There's a slight delay on YouTube, but it's pinned on YouTube.
Great, okay.
And if anyone else needs to pin it, they just need to select the pin, hover over Dan's picture, and then click the pin to the left.
Okay, so I've just seen there from Matt, maybe a simple one, but how to remove and replace the rear H badge. Perhaps we can look at that in a moment. Dan's just gone to get a drink. Can you see okay? And we're back on feed again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ian, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this or not, but I just wanted to show everyone while we're waiting for Dan to come back some of the interior enhancements I've done here. So as you can see, I've got a steering wheel refurb done on here. Am I allowed to call out who did that for me?
Yeah, of course you are.
Yeah, so it's Robin A3.
Robin A3, yeah, or Robin Yow.
Yeah. Superb job. This is an exchange one. I don't know if you can see the stitching on there, but he's actually done a superb job there. And I've also done the gaiter on the gear lever and also on the armrest there. Absolute superb job. Of course, one of the other things is to get the cam cover refurbed. Again, that's an exchange one. That made a huge difference when I did that a couple of years ago.
Where did you get your cam cover done?
And it stopped raining here too. Who's the guy on the forum, Ian? I can't. I'm sorry, my brain's gone blank.
It was Spooner Restorations or Ross Dunn. The two popular ones.
Did I do it?
No, you didn't do it. But who's the guy on the forum that does it? Spooner. Sorry, yes,
yeah, Spooner Restoration.
Spooner did the cam cover, and he's on the forum. Cup of coffee,
Sorry, I'm trying to accommodate my wife's various demands. In a car washing sense, nothing else.
My wife is actually on the feed here. So just a few things from the chat. Sander, yeah, very nice. I'm considering changing all the bushes and stuff, so very useful. Matt Taylor said maybe a simple one, but how to remove and replace the rear H badge. I don't know if we can look at that. Perhaps.
Yeah, we can. Well, I won't remove it, but yeah, we can do that. So.
Yeah. Right. So
a question: is it too detailed? Not detailed enough? I'm a nerd. I'm sure you've worked that already. Do you need as much detail as I'm giving, or are you happy for me to carry on as is? Anyone?
I'm not sure if that's.
I think Chris was saying something then, but he's on mute.
Is it just on there, is it?
No.
Yeah, no, it's very good.
Is
Excellent.
Yeah. Do you want to just sort that out?
Yeah.
Don't really want to home too much. There we go. Sorry, we had the volume down a bit low there. Sorry.
Sorry. What was the answer? More or less detail, or are we at Goldilocks? Are we just right?
Keep going.
Keep going.
Good
right.
stuff.
Good. Okay.
Steve's having a chocolate biscuit for lunch.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
That's a good idea, actually. Right. So we've done. Oh, I'm going to show you the tools I use.
Yeah.
Just for so. I would say actually tool one in the arsenal is that, just back where we were there, is the impact gun, wherever it is. Reason being, it produces an enormous amount of torque, and you don't have to have a huge bar and trying to turn it into access into spaces that you don't have. So if you know you're replacing the bushes, there's not so much reason to try and preserve them. I'm just going to probably go and store them because it's quite windy. Just one sec. Then, yeah, so an impact gun is good, but again, it's not necessarily going to be something you want to lash out on.
Is that a tool that can be hired, Dan, or do you think it? Because they're quite expensive to buy, aren't they?
Yeah, they come down a lot actually. That's a DeWalt one, which I use quite a lot of DeWalt stuff because the 18-volt packs are interchangeable with the light, with the leaf blower, with my drill, so on and so forth. So that's the brand I like, but Makita's good, Ryobi's good. There's lots of them out there. If you do buy an impact gun, a couple of £100 you can spend. You can probably get cheaper ones. I'm sure they're fine. But they just take some of the stress out of trying to turn tight or stuck fixings into small spaces, particularly if they're between, say, like the rear subframe, between two bars. You can't really get much movement. You end up kind of inching it around. There's good kit to have in the toolbox. Only thing you might want to consider is when you buy one that's probably not the end of the cost, you shouldn't really use conventional CV chrome vanadium sockets with an impact gun because they can shatter in the most extreme cases. So you want to try and get some hardened ones that are made specifically for an impact gun. So that's one thing. If you're splashing out, it's a good tool to have, not just for bushings, but that's one of the tools that helps me get the job done. The other one is this, which is much cheaper. This is actually just from Screwfix, I think. And this is a reciprocating saw. So you've got Christmas dinner with the in-laws round and you want to carve the turkey, it's quite good for that as well. But basically, you get a number of different. You can get different blades. So you've got wood saws there. You've got stainless blades, steel blades there, high speed.
Is this to get the H badge off?
This is to get the H badge off, or if the roof's got a tear in it, or if your passenger won't stop moaning. It addresses quite a lot of problems, to be honest. Some with more legal implications than others. But yeah, so it's very, very simple. You just clip a blade in the end here. It's still dirt. I'm sawing a tree with it. And this is very useful because I'll find a blade to give you an example. If we go back round to the car, I'll show you why this particular tool is more advantageous sometimes than something like an angle grinder. Go back to the wheel arch. So, in certain situations, you might be able to see. I don't know how easy it is.
Let me see if I can come underneath there.
Maybe try from the top. I don't know what you can see. So try.
No, I think we have to go from underneath. There we go.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Again, I don't know how well you guys can see it because Andy's the cameraman. But you can see a saber saw will be a reciprocating saw blade. If this was an OEM bush, you'd be able to do a lot more cutting in the space that you need to do it. If you come in with an angle grinder, they are generally limited on length because of how they mount. I'll show you the angle grinder I use in a minute, but you would probably, if you weren't particularly careful, if you came near with an angle grinder, you might end up either running out of space on this upper part of the wishbone, or you could actually, if you're really unlucky, you'd end up cutting the subframe itself because they're not that precise. The saber saw gives you just an extra degree of accuracy with it. If you do come and do the job, that saber saw was 60 quid, 70 quid, and it's done 30 or 40 S2000s, and it never complains. So it's been very reliable. These blades, again, everyone has their preferred brand, but try and get ones. I'll show you. Try and get ones as long as you can, so you've got a bit more choice with it. These are the ones I use. So the Bosch blades. I can't remember what the teeth per inch is. Can't remember, but yeah, they're the ones that I use. So the 225mm ones, the 25 centimetre ones, and they work really well with this tool. I haven't yet come across an S2000 that needs rebushing that these haven't been necessary for. So that's one tool.
How many blades did we get through when you replaced these bushes? Quite a few, wasn't it?
That's the thing. Yeah, good question. The bush collars themselves, I mean, they'll go through the rubber, no problem, as you'd expect, but the bush collars themselves are quite hard. I would say probably 2 blades of bush is quite normal. You maybe even 3. So these are in packs of 5. Wouldn't hurt getting 10, possibly even 15. They're not that expensive. They're probably 11, 12 quid a go, and you'll only do the job once. You can help yourself a lot. You say that, go in that side if you want.
Yep.
By getting some of this or an equivalent as well. So this is cutting oil. Again, without boring you with the science of friction and metallurgy, the biggest thing that will slow your cutting down will be excessive heat. It will blunt the blades, it will blunt the teeth, bend the teeth, so on and so forth. If you use a good quality cutting oil, this one's pretty decent to be honest, you keep the blade temperature in check and you'll do much more cutting with one blade. So as you're doing, you just want an occasional spray or stop what you're doing and come and spray the area. That's just one way. You don't have to do that, but you'll probably use more blades otherwise.
Other cutting oil brands are available.
Precisely, yeah. I'm not sponsored by, I forget who makes WD-40, but Unilever maybe. So that's one of the tools I use.
Hang on, I've just got a coffee delivered to me here. Let me just get that.
That's something else. Next one is ye old angle grinder.
Just come this side.
Again, I won't. It's a bit like an unboxing video. This I've seen them on YouTube. So yeah, I use a smaller angle grinder delivery. I have a larger one down there in the kit, but I tend to go for these ones with the 115mm blades. This one's all my old blades. There's some new ones down there, but this will do. It's easier to cut with this than the saber saw. It's going to be faster, but as you can imagine, when you're trying to work in a smaller space, the body of the angle grinder starts to bang into things. There starts to be a problem. Even, I mean, this blade's a little bit worn down because it's just an old one, but even when they're new, there's only a tiny bit more range on it. They're good for making the first cuts, and particularly, I'm not sure who asked or who said they were taking the subframes off. You'll have a lot more success with the subframes off with this because you can get to the parts you need to get to. On the
Somebody's muted everybody.
Oh, okay.
Okay, my mic should be back on now.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, you're back on.
Yeah.
Cool. And the final tool, if you really get into any amount of DIY, this is the emergency. This is DEFCON 1. So always looked a bit to me like a firework. I don't know why it's this snazzy colour, but this is an induction heater or a bolt heater, basically. Similar principle to wireless charging or Oral-B toothbrush or whatever you want to call it. But you have, this is a slightly old and crusty one, but you have these induction coils. So these two prongs fit into this, and anything ferrous, anything metallic that's inside the coils is heated red hot in about 10 or 15 seconds. And this is especially useful if you're working in areas where you don't want a naked flame. Around the fuel tank would be a good example.
We used it on removing my cat off the exhaust, didn't we?
Yeah, we didn't have to use it there, but it's very, very quick. It's very, very efficient, and it gets bolts quite literally red, white hot in about 20 or 30 seconds. You get different size heads. This one is really old and knackered. You also get in the kit that I bought just a free loop of wire, so you could, for instance, wrap that around the steering arm if you wanted to free that one up. So,
is Sophie on this, Ian?
Why is that?
I'll tell you later.
Yeah, she is.
Okay. What's she said?
It's just it.
Although I think she might have disappeared from the screen at the moment.
Yeah, it's.
Sorry, what's the tool called again? That's from Ian.
It's called a bolt buster, and it comes from boltbuster.co.uk, I think. I'm sure it's American, I think, so we'll probably made in China. It's certainly not for what I can only speculate people might be saying it's useful. Well, I've never used it for that anyway, but different strokes and all that. So all of that stuff is nice to have. It's certainly not necessary, but like all nice to haves, they do make your life a bit easier. It's entirely possible to do it with a manual saw, a hacksaw and the rest of it, but do not underestimate how long that will take. The best things I can recommend is find out how bad your particular car is. So a good soaking, all the bushes inside, outside, of every angle you can get to. I like Plus Gas as a lubricating fluid, but WD-40 is good as well, and AC 50, I think, is another one. There's lots of different ones. Get a good coating of that on that at least once, if not twice, and get out there, loosen the locking nut, or in the case of the caster bush, the locking bolt out. The nuts and the bolts will come free, and just try and turn and see what you've got. You'll be very, very lucky if you don't have any seized ones. If you don't, that's good. First thing you want to do is dismantle the whole lot and grease it, and there's lots of how-tos about how to do that, and make sure you preserve your investment. But if you do have at least one seized one, as people said earlier, you're almost certainly going to be buying brand new wishbones, very expensive, second-hand wishbones, which will have bushes of unknown condition, or you're going to go down the aftermarket route, Powerflex, Polybush. I can't remember who makes the yellow ones. There's a brand I see them on eBay all the time. But I'm not going to tell you which one's better than others, but I like Polybush ones. They're about 500 quid for the whole car. And well, if you rate the improvement, Andy, then
yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I combined this. We actually fitted the coilovers at the same time, and there was a marked improvement in the handling of the car. I felt a lot more planted on the road, a lot more confident in it. So yeah, I'm more than happy with that upgrade.
Yeah.
So So any more questions on bushes? I obviously want to pick up on Matt, because Matt has asked about removal of the H badge on the rear. Perhaps we can just cover that quickly.
Yeah, that's a very easy one.
But just feed through any more questions on the chat, or just call them out.
Sure.
You're going to do the TCT as well?
Yeah, we can do that.
If people aren't so bored of listening to me rabbit on, I will gladly show you whatever you want to see. So
yeah, if we're okay for time, Ian, we'll do that. How long do you think we need for that one? 15 minutes.
Without questions, I can remove the TCT in about 10 minutes. It's whether you want to see the dismantling, what we're actually doing it for.
So perhaps we just
do the H badge first.
We'll do the H badge first. Let's do that one.
Right. So H badge removal, if you want to do it. So behind here, you'll find two small holes. There's kind of an adhesive backing on it, and a sealing around the badge. Probably behind you, Andy, I probably do have an old badge to show you. But you don't actually need to do much of or any of the manipulation from the rear. You need to do, as another joke for anyone who's in that frame of mind, you do most of it, or in fact all of it, from the front. So one thing to be aware of, the boot skinning on S2000s is really thin. I should demonstrate now with a slight deformation. The reason why that's relevant is my tool of choice is a heat gun.
Am I going to regret this?
I'm not actually going to do it. So this is not a hairdryer, despite it looking like one. This is just a very, very simple paint stripping DIYer's heat gun. You again, loads of different uses. I think this was from Amazon, 30 quid. It wasn't a lot, basically. Generates an enormous amount of localized heat, which is exactly what you need for softening adhesives. When you come to do this, if you use a heat gun, don't get too close or for too long next to the boot, because you can damage the paint, obviously, but you can ripple the metal because it's that much thinner. So if you're going to use a heat gun, all you're trying to do is soften the adhesive behind the badge. So this has two settings for heat, 1 and 2. If you're going to use the hottest setting, literally on from probably, I don't know what that is, 30 centimeters for about 5 seconds or so, take back off. If you get to a point that you can't even touch the panel, you've probably made it too hot. The glue will soften long before that, soften enough to remove it.
Which setting do you use for your hair, Dan?
At the moment, I just stand outside. That's why it looks like this, and let the hurricane do its worst. But yeah, I've got some fabulous products inside, as you'd imagine. So that's to soften the glue part. If you don't have a heat gun, you can use the other half's hairdryer or something. You don't have to use heat at all. But this is one of those things. You'll get the badge off without it, but you will spend the rest of the afternoon or the weekend and probably lose about an inch of your thumb just rubbing off the old glue that's left behind.
So I've seen on some YouTube feeds, some people using dental floss to get behind there.
You can use dental floss if you have it. I, in experience, have found it to not be strong enough. Okay. Yeah, maybe. If you get the key is getting the glue soft enough. You get the glue soft enough, yeah, by all means, get dental floss behind the badge and work it up. That's a good way to do it, to be honest. So before you start the job, with or without a heat gun, clean the area, because you're going to be levering on it. You're going to be leaning on it in some way, so you don't basically muck up your paintwork, excessively. What I would do if I did use the dental floss, then if you were a dab hand with it, you would go round the badge. So basically cutting the glue. The glue is behind any of the sections you can see here, obviously. And in kind of the points of the H are where those two locating pins are that go through the holes. So if you just sort of drag the floss downward, you'll hit the pins. You won't be able to get it. But at that point, just sort of turn it around, cut the glue with the floss if it works for you, or you can use a strong wire. Try not to use a metal wire because it's more likely to scratch. If you can cut the glue, you'll find it will just lift off. When you do the lifting, if it is resisting you a bit, try and lever from the thickest part of the badge, not the thinnest, because otherwise it will just snap, particularly when it's old and brittle. Assuming you don't use the dental floss approach, and there really is no magic to this, if I can just grab something from there, I would use a very, very small screwdriver, or I have a prying tool here, and I'll show you that as well. Remember my way around the toolbox. So you would want to get a fine prying tool. This is actually an interior prying tool, something you'd use to get door trims and clips off. But depending on the one you get, sometimes they have a usefully thin end, and being plastic, it's less likely to damage anything. If you don't have that, or if you are skilled enough to use a small screwdriver, then what I would do, I'm not actually going to do this obviously, is that use a cloth to take up the load, and just get it underneath and try and start bringing it forward with the screwdriver. Do it from the corners, and once you get a bit free, particularly if the glue is hot, it will come off nice and easily. Mm-hmm. If you, again, I don't think, just for example, if I actually tried to get this under there, it does go. I don't know if you can, I don't know how clear that's coming up, but that, if I wanted to, that would actually come off reasonably easily, to give you an example. But I mean, that's not an especially fine point, but it still went under there. When you remove it, again, if you're careful with the heat gun, you can soften the glue enough that you'll basically roll it off with your thumb and forefinger. But if you want to go purely down the chemical approach, white spirit will soften it. Try and use a microfiber cloth, not a coarse cloth, nothing abrasive, because you will mark the paint around it. Just take your time. Heat's good. in moderation to soften the glue.
Isopropyl alcohol.
Yeah, IPA. Yeah, IPA is another good example. I work in pharmaceuticals, so I borrowed some from work a while back, and IPA is very good. Try not to use anything that's going to it's going to damage the paint or the paint finish. Try not to use petrol, things like that. You can use boiling water, just under boiling water to soften the glue. But if you try and remove the glue while it's cold and hard, basically, you'll be there forever. So that's probably all I can say. Just take your time, be careful, consider the material you're using. If it's harder than the paintwork of the car, which most things are, you're probably going to mark it. So try and find something a bit softer or be very, very careful. Does that help?
Great. Thank you, Dan. Hopefully that's okay, Matt. Presumably you're going to be replacing them with some different coloured badges, perhaps?
Or filling the holes.
Or even filling in the holes.
Yeah, so there's 2 holes behind. So if you do remove it, make sure you've got a backup plan, because you will have 2 sort of 6mm holes behind there. So.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful. So just putting the other one back in. Will it have the pins and you just slot them?
A genuine Honda one will. So yeah, it will come with a peel off adhesive layer that you could just obviously take off and press back in. The 2 locating tabs will take the guesswork out. So when they assemble the car in the factory, it's just a matter of smacking it in, so you'll be fine. The aftermarket ones, particularly some of the eBay ones, again, I don't know exactly what you plan to put in. Some have the holes, some don't. If they don't, you're obviously going to have to be a lot more conscious of your measurements to make sure it's accurate, even and in line. And the only thing I have seen myself is some people put red badges on, like the Type R Hondas. If you get the eBay ones, and I can't say all of them the same, but sometimes the red section goes pink alarmingly quickly.
I was just going to put in like-for-like replacement.
Yeah, if you're going like for like, then yeah, you'll have 2 pins and an adhesive backing, smack it straight in. So,
many thanks for that. It's great.
No, I hope it helps.
TCT?
TCT. Right, let's put this back.
Right, to the front of the car.
Yeah.
I've been checking the chat as we've been going along. I think I've got everyone's question. So if you think we've missed something, please just post it up again. And we'll make sure we pick that up.
Rightio. So the much maligned TCT or timing chain tensioner.
Should we get some light in there?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'm actually going to put the bonnet in the raised position.
Right, so this is worth doing as well. So if anyone doesn't know about this.
Get a bit more light in there. If you want to, there's 2 positions to the bonnet lift, for anyone who didn't know this. First thing you need to do, back here, you have the rubber line that runs to the screen wash, the windscreen washers. So there's a little hole here where my finger is. I don't know if you can see that. If you press in there, there's a little tab. And as you pull the hose out, and it's got a bit of crud on his one, but this tab basically hooks in there. And because we're going to be lifting the bonnet up much higher, you would find this goes very taut. So if you take it out of there, you'll find it doesn't sit quite as taut. So do that bit first. The next thing you need to do is remove the bonnet strut or the upright from its original location and move it to a location over here. So we'll grab a light just to make that. I don't know how has it come up?
Probably need a light on that one.
Yeah, let's put a light on that. So
bear with us.
Better. So over here on the driver's side wing for us, this side of the pond, there's this little eyelet here. We're actually going to move the bonnet strut into that, and then we're going to make it lock into the bonnet in this hole here, rather than the conventional one that it's in at the moment. And this just gives you a lot more access to the back of the engine and the ability to get light in from where we are now. So if you're on your own, there's a time-honoured technique I've perfected, which is nothing more scientific than balancing the bonnet on your head. But if you have a faithful assistant, bonnet on the head, this comes out of here. You might need a bit of WD-40 to get it out of there. And then once it's out, keep the bonnet up. It's fine, got it. And then it just hooks in. It can only go in one way in that hole I mentioned to you earlier. And then you'll find lift it up, it will lift into there. And what you have is a lot more access on the access to the whole engine. Very useful when you're doing valve adjustments or anything down the back of the engine if you're come to do a transmission removal to do a clutch or whatever it may be. So
I'm just going to adjust the selfie stick just so we get a bit closer here.
Is it working all right?
Yeah, it's all good. Right.
Okay, good.
So,
as we said earlier, Andy has an aftermarket intake, which actually is going to make this a little easier to see what we're doing. On standard S2000s, as you know, you have the large air box at the front. It doesn't change the job, but you have just a little bit less room to manoeuvre. So first things first, I'll very quickly summarise why you might be concerned with this job. As I said before, there's lots on the internet, there's lots on YouTube about this. But basically, the timing chain tensioner, as you would imagine, keeps tension on the timing chain, and it does so hydraulically. So it uses oil pressure driven by the engine to push on a guide, which pushes in turn on the timing chain and keeps it at the correct level of tension for as the chain wears and as the engine warms up and cools down and so on and so forth. The main reason you'll come to know about this or be thinking about it is if you start hearing TCT rattle or TCT tick, both of which sounds a bit like, I've heard it likened to when you know, as a kid, put playing card in the spokes of your bike, that sort of ticking noise. Off the top of my head, yours does slightly do it.
Got a slight rattle, yeah.
So this is actually quite a beneficial job to do for today as anything. Now, what I'm going to show you is how to remove the timing chain tensioner and actually dismantle it into its component parts. There's 6/7 parts that it comes away as. It can look very daunting, but it really only goes back one way. But if nothing else, you'll have this video and you'll have this guide to show you how it all goes together. What we're mainly concerned with in this approach is roughing up or sanding the surface of the worm gear. Now, don't worry too much if you don't have a clue what a worm gear is. It will become obvious when you see it. Well, I'm actually going to use some 400 grit sandpaper and just a manual method to rough it up, and I'll show you where you take the shiny bits on the worm gear away into more of a matte rough finish, and I'll also explain why you'd want that. So this method requires no replacement parts. It requires a sheet of, I use 400 grit sandpaper. You could probably use a 100 grit in either direction. You don't want it too fine because you don't want the surface too smooth, and you certainly don't want it too coarse because you don't want it to drag in its mechanism in the piston itself. This is my way of doing it. It's not a guaranteed for life fix. So I've done this on cars like my own, for instance, and 5 years without a noise. But equally, if the timing chain was really, really warm before I did it, it's come back in sort of 6-12 months. I offer you this because it's a very cheap way to refurbish it, make the noise go away. And if the internals of your TCT are not that worn, it might last for the life of the car. If you don't want to do this, you can buy Honda OEM replacements, but be certain they will do this again at some point, somewhere down the line. Or you can go to the aftermarket. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who knows more, Ballard Sports make a replacement. There's an engineer from the American side of the forum called Billman, and he does a kind of a refurbishment and an improved TCT. I think he reprofiles the original one. It's a lot to do with larger bore oil passages and increasing the flow on it. There might be a third aftermarket alternative as well. But it's up to you if you go down those routes. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. But this way is something you can do yourself in your garage with, 20 pence sheet of sandpaper if you want to. It looks more daunting than it is. So with that in mind, then I'll crack on with it. So the timing chain tensioner is located down on the driver's side of the engine. It's going to be difficult to show you without getting my hand in the way of everything. But here at the top is the BTEC solenoid and the oil pressure switch and so on. The TCT is just below that. And I don't know how well you can see. Actually, let me get a pointing.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to be able to get the camera completely down in there without removing the. No.
But it'll make more sense when you come to remove it. So the TCT is what I'm actually tapping my screwdriver on right now. If there's any way you can see that at all.
There's the heat shields in the way.
Yeah. Maybe coming from that angle.
Yeah, maybe we're going to try a slightly different angle here.
So the TCT is what I'm tapping on here. So don't be confused. It's not this device here. This is the BTEC solenoid. It's just below it. And it's held on to the engine with two 10mm headed bolts. Excuse me. Now, there's some tips and tricks that you kind of pick up if you grab it by the handle if you like. So, yeah. Sorry, Andy's just adjusting the lighting in these socially distanced way. Is that okay? Can you see it? So again, I'm not sure what you can see on the feed, but so this is the timing chain tensioner here that I'm pointing at, and you have a 10mm bolt either side, and you have, don't be confused, you have 10mm bolts holding a cap on. Now, the removal of the cap is relevant, and I'll explain why as we get into it. As a preface, I always recommend doing this with a cold engine. Main reason being, not only that you don't, burn yourself or scald yourself with hot oil. When you remove the timing chain tensioner, you will lose a little bit of oil. It's a pressurized oil-fed system, so even if the engine's been off for a little while, there will be residual oil in the area and in the TCT itself, probably more than you think. So I recommend doing that with a cold engine, so you don't have any of the safety issues. The other reason is oil, of course, changes thickness, viscosity when it's hot and when it's cold. So the colder the oil is, the less runny it is. So if you do this with a roasting hot engine, not only are you working against the heat, but the oil that is in the area will be more runny. It will make more of a mess. And the final reason I recommend doing this with a cold engine is just down to the stress on the threads and the bolts. So there is use of aluminium in this part of the engine, which is softer than steel. So it's not so much a problem when you're undoing, although it can be an issue, but certainly if you were to try and refit this and you were a bit heavy-handed with a steel bolt into the aluminium, you would almost certainly thread it. You'd damage the threads, so cross-thread it, or you'd end up pulling the threads out of the recess, which is really not what you want to do. You don't want to be trying to drill a helicoil or a thread insert in there or some other fix. With a cold engine, that issue's not completely removed because you're still working with aluminium, but it's massively reduced because the metal isn't quite as malleable, isn't quite as pliable when it's hot. So that's just something I recommend. This engine, as I say, has been here for a couple of hours now.
So we've got a message here from Flying Laps on YouTube, says get some wire wool on that poor VTEC solenoid.
Yeah, that's not necessarily a DIY, but there's a ton of VTEC caps or things like that. So yeah, if you wanted to wire wool it or sand it, you could. If you remove it, and if you want to show that, there's 3 bolts up here. So you've got one there, and one there. There is a gasket under here, which, ask me how I know, Honda don't sell separately. Yeah. So you can get aftermarket ones. There's no guarantee you'd need to replace it, but you wouldn't want to take this off, sand it, and then find out that put it back on and find out that you've got an oil leak from this area, and you'd need to replace the gasket underneath. I would recommend replacing the gasket underneath. So yes, but if you don't do the wire wool sanding thing, you can do what I did, and you can get, I think I've got a password JDM one that just sits over this, basically.
Just sits on the cap, doesn't it?
Just sits on the cap. It doesn't fall off. You could use like a double-sided pad or something if you wanted to, but that I suggest is more of a bling one than
yeah, well, there is bling on this car.
I can see that.
As you can see.
Right, so get going.
Is everyone able to see that? It's quite difficult to get a decent camera angle because of the heat shield that's here. Just wondering if I'll maybe flip it upside down. There we go. Right, so I know it's upside down, but can you see that there now? There we go. So there's the 2 bolts that Dan was talking about.
Yeah, you're going to say without me there, you can probably get in a little easier. Right, all I've done over here, to show people, is you're going to need a space to work on the timing chain tensioner. As I said earlier, it has a lot more oil in it than you think it might have. So I've just used an old mat on the bench and put some paper towel down. Try and keep the whole area clean if you can. It's not an area, I mean, we will be putting cleaning fluids into it after to sort of get the old residual oil out. But you don't really want to get grit and dirt and other things that you can avoid getting in there if at all possible. So, right. First things first, what I would recommend doing is removing the, I always use, this is a 1/4-inch socket and this is a 1/4-inch drive socket, square drive socket, and a 10mm. The reason I use this one is because you can't put a lot of torque on fixings. It's more relevant when you're doing it up. You can use a torque wrench if you want to, But you should be aware that over time, particularly if this has been off before, if bolts have stretched, if threads have changed, the torque figures that the manual, the Honda manual, if you use one, might not be necessarily relevant because if the bolt has changed shape, the tightness will be different. What you'll feel at the wrench will be different. So for that reason, for jobs like this, it's up to you if you want to use one, but a torque wrench, as accurate as they are, you might find you're putting on more torque than you need to. And they're really not tight, these bolts. Off the top of my head, I think they are 7 or 8 Newton meters, something like that. Don't quote me on that. That's really, really low. So if you come into this area with a ratchet that's too large, or you don't necessarily have the finesse, you're possibly going to damage it. So use a smaller ratchet if you can. They shouldn't be that tight. Your watch will be really tight now. So anyway, in this area, again, Andy, I don't know exactly how we're going to capture it.
I think I've shown you where the bolts are, but yeah.
I'm just for reference, I'm going to unplug Andy's oil pressure switch just to make a little bit more room. Nothing complicated about that. So just to press tab, a simple connection. Make sure you plug it in at the end. So let's get that out of the way.
Yeah, that's much better view.
If you can actually see what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Is that all right? And the light's in the right place.
Yeah, no, that's
so.
all
As
good.
I said earlier, it's difficult to describe, but you've got a bolt here and a bolt here for the cap. That's what will be taken off. And then further back, it's very, very difficult to show you. There's 2 10mm bolts further back on the block. I've got my hand on one of them. Where am I? Yeah. There. I've got my thumb and forefinger on one of them now. It's very difficult to see, but it doesn't matter if you undo the cap first, because we actually want to take that off anyway, but don't undo the VTEC solenoid. So I'm going to undo the cap first, and I'll show you why later on. So all I'm going to do, again, I'm sorry.
Now we get to back off that while Dan does undo the bolts.
I'm actually going to loosen the cap and then just do the bolts back up, just a little bit. So that's already fallen loose. So that's. I'm just going to wind that one back in. And the reason why is if these bolts are a bit tight, you're undoing them against the force of the TCT being locked in the engine, which is easier. If you try and do this outside, you've then got to try and put the TCT in a vise or counter hold it. And if you do that, you can mark it and so on and so forth. So I've loosened the cap bolts. You can see that one's loose and the one down here is loose as well. Now I'm actually going to undo the TCT bolts themselves. So where my index finger is now, there's only 2 bolts holding this onto the body. So I'm going to undo this one here. And as I said, they shouldn't be too tight, and this one isn't. So that's loose already. Good. I'm actually just going to get a longer reach. I've got a short 10mm on this. I'm actually going to get a longer one just to help me. Now we've got to try and do the back one. One towards the back, more towards the back of the engine, which is up here. Now, one of 2 things will happen at this point. As you start to back the bolts out, either the TCT will stay where it is because it's held in place with its rubber seals, or it will start to come forward and start to be pushed out because it's slightly under spring pressure. So let's see. At that point, you don't want to take these bolts all the way out. So loosen them and then see if you can bring them out halfway or so. Let's see what Andy's TCT is going to do. So I've just brought that back thread out. I'm going to show that, if you can.
If I go down there. There we go. Yeah.
I've just brought this thread out, maybe about 2 mil or so. I'm just going to do the same with the one on the other side. And this TCT is staying put. Sort of. So I've backed those bolts out. They're still in there. And the reason you want to leave them in there is because I'm going to rock the TCT now and it's going to try and come forward. If the bolts weren't in there, it could spring out and it could drop on the floor and all kinds of things. So in a moment, when I pull the TCT out, there'll be a slight weep of oil. So I'm just getting some blue rolls, some towel, whatever you've got, just to absorb it. Okay. I'm just going to put that underneath. There's actually quite a good place to sort of jam it just above the pipework for where the oil filter is. So you just want to get it there so, just to keep your working area a bit tidier. So I'm going to take the left hand, to me, bolt completely out. Just wind that completely out. again, this is one of those jobs that when you do it, everything will make a lot more sense than trying to watch my efforts on a camera with a limited angle. So that's the bolt out on the left-hand side. Just keep that out of the way. Now, this one here, the last remaining bolt that's holding it in, is about ½ inch. So I'm just going to try and move the TCT. These can be a bit stubborn if they've never been out before. This one's going to come out. I have to just feel that. But if it doesn't want to, with a rubber or wooden implement, so if you've got a small rubber mallet or grab yourself a stick of wood and just drift, just tap on it basically. It will come loose. Try and avoid prying on it against the softer metal of the engine. If you can, try not to lever it out. So have the bolt most of the way out, but just enough to still catch you. And just try and rock and turn the TCT, which is what I'm doing now.
Come around from the other side.
Let's see. So as I say, sometimes they're more stubborn than others, but try not to lever and pry unless you absolutely have to. He says.
Okay, yeah, I'm going landscape better.
Was it people asking for landscape?
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes the angles are difficult, but I'll try and keep it as landscape as I can. Is that okay?
Right. This is actually it's coming out. I've got a small gap now, so
perfect. Thanks. Yes, much better.
I know this looks very, very sort of crowded, but it's when you actually come to do the work, there's more room than you think. And when I get the TCT out, it'll make a lot more sense. Let's put it that way. Right, I'm just going to give that a whack with a rubber mallet. Let's see if I can free it up. And by whack, I mean a sensitive tap. Be careful while you're in here.
It's not a good idea to use his car as a...
What's that?
This is where Andy's beginning to think using his car as a demo is...
Yeah. We'll wait for the snapping and the subsequent explosion.
I have had some disclaimers signed.
Right, that very, very tactical tap with the mallet has freed the TCT up. So I don't know if you can see, but it's now slid out to the end of what was available on the bolt.
Get the camera in there a little bit more. Yeah, there we go.
There's the bolt, and it's now slid out and closed the gap. So with my remaining hand, my left hand, I'm going to hold the TCT in. It's not an incredible spring force, but it is trying to push itself out. So keep it counter held while you back the rest of the bolt out, which is what I'm doing now. So that bolt is now completely out. So the TCT is in my hands. And as you pull it out of the car, try and tip it upwards like a cup. Not only will you keep all the objects in it, I mean, they're not going to fly out otherwise, but you'll also keep the oil drips at the bay. So I'm just pulling the TCT out now. And if you can see that.
Good angle on that. There we go.
A bit of oil there, as we said earlier. And that's the TCT. Try and keep it upright. So we'll move to the bench.
Right.
One timing chain tensioner.
Do you want to talk us through the main components?
Yeah. We'll strip it all down. You can see. So, is this relevant, guys? Do you want me to keep going on this tone?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'll just try and make it stand for a second. So. Right. So. Assuming that your TCT didn't spring all over the place, this is what you should have got it out like. Not too much to see at this exact point in time. You've got 2 O-rings, or sealing rings, should I say. Well worth getting into good light and just having a look round to make sure they're not nicked or scored, or you make sure they're not missing completely, although you probably would have had an oil leak if they were. I believe you can replace these. I think you can get replacements for them when they are just an O-ring. However, because they live in a relatively good environment in the engine, you know, they're lubricated, they're oiled. It's unusual that they need replacing. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but if you look at them, it's very difficult to pick up on the camera. But if the rubber still sits proud of the metal that it's between, they're probably okay because the heat will expand that. So that's something to note. If you had a leak from the area, it would almost certainly be one of these 2 seals. So that's something to think about. So when it comes to dismantling, first thing I'm going to do is take out the piston, which will probably bring the worm gear with it. No, it hasn't. That's interesting. So either way, this is the piston. Nothing too complicated about this. Just going to try and lay this down so it doesn't make such a mess when all the oil comes out. Yeah, so this is the
the piston. This is the main part that interacts with the timing chain guide. You can see there's two reliefs either side, two square cutouts. This actually engages with the gear to stop it turning, and I will talk about more about that in a moment. So I'll clean my hands up. Next thing I'm going to take out, we've got the tensioning spring and the locking cap. So this is the tensioning spring, and this is the locking cap or the locking pin. This, as you saw earlier, there isn't, don't worry, first of all, there isn't a side to this. You can have that either side. It doesn't matter when you come to reassemble. So this is sitting in there like so. But when you reassemble it, it's not as daunting as it looks. It does make sense. So pin, spring. The next thing that's going to come out here, in addition to a shitload of oil, is going to be the worm gear and the outer spring or the piston spring. So let's see what happens. And not too bad, enough. This is the worm gear. This is the point, the part of the job that we're going to make the noise go away with. So we'll keep that separately. There's the worm gear, and it hasn't come out yet, but there is a larger spring in here. There we go. That's the piston spring, and that's it for the main body of the assembly. All that's left now is to remove the cap, and I'll show you one of the oil jets that you have to take out in order to reassemble afterwards. Everyone following so far? Do you want me to repeat any bits or show you any other bits?
All good. It's all obviously good. Very popular because we're up to our most viewers so far on YouTube Live.
Okay, good. Right, so hopefully in this view it's a little easier to see. So when the TCT was sitting in the car, obviously I undid this bolt and this bolt to take it out. But before that, I also undid this bolt and this bolt. Reason being, if I didn't, as you try and turn these while it's free in your hand, and particularly when you've got oily hands like me, this is just going to spin around all day long. If you do have to clamp this in a vise, I really, really recommend using a t-shirt, a towel, a cloth or something like that. If you were to put it in the vise, don't mark the body. This is very, very soft. If you clamp it at all, put it in the exposed bits that have been on the outside of the engine. Do not clamp this section here if you ever had to counter hold it. They're not so tight, the bolts, but you do sometimes get them as they're a bit stiff and then they sort of snap free. So one of the things I picked up along the way from doing this is to loosen them ever so slightly while it's still fitted in the car, because of course it's counter held by being bolted into the head, if that makes sense. So anyway, take these two bolts out, which are now loose. And this whole cap's going to come off and it's going to expose the main jet, the oil jet, which goes into the body of the TCT. So there's another rubber seal on this cap, which is worth inspecting. Let's get this off. So this is the main cap. Let me just clean it up a bit so you can see what I'm on about. Same sort of thing as you saw on the O-rings on the main part of the body. It should still sit proud. You're not going to be able to see it on a camera, unfortunately, but take my word for it. It's still sitting slightly proud of the metal, which means it's still very likely to form a good seal. You may be able to replace it, but for what I understand of main dealers, Honda just want to sell your whole TCT. So if this is in good nick, it's not split, it's not torn, or some other defect with it, the cap's not warped, then there's no reason why you can't reuse this. I have done before. In fact, this TCT has been refurbed. Yeah, one of the first jobs we did, probably
it has. It was replaced maybe 6 years ago, and then it's been refurbed in between.
Okay, cool. Right, so that leaves the only last part to take out that we need to do for this job is this part here, which is the
getting close on that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's focusing or not.
Is that focusing okay, everyone? Yeah.
So this is the main jet. This is the oil jet. So if you can imagine how this cap sits when it sits over the engine, it forms a seal in here. So you've got various oil passageways here, and this screw here, this jet is actually, it's a jet, unsurprisingly, it's the middle. We'll take that out, to have a look at it, but also we have to in order to reassemble the TCT afterwards. When you come to take it out, you want to undo it with a flat screwdriver, but just as an interesting point, this is not really suitable. Main reason being is it doesn't fill the hole flat, and it's also, and if you can't really see that, but it's actually quite loose in there. So this is surprisingly tight. I mean, the torque isn't very high, but they are usually quite tight. So I have a specific screwdriver that I use for this because it fits really well. So that's when you do, I'm going to tell you how to do your job, so make sure it's nice and tight. You grab it nice and tight and it should just come free like that, which it has. This is not an area that you want to use power tools for any part of this job if you can avoid it, because you won't have the control of the feel to know if something's coming loose or if you're damaging it. So keep spinning that out, and we'll take the oil jet out completely, which is there. Nothing more complicated than that. It's threaded. Obviously, that's the part that held it in, and it's hollow through the middle just to provide a pressurized oil into the inside of the piston. And this is as dismantled as we need to be. So this next bit's going to be quite difficult to catch on the camera. So I'm going to go and grab my light, and I'll try and show you what the main concern is, where the noise comes from, and what we're going to do to fix it. So in this pot here, nothing. It's just brake cleaner. You know, it's the same stuff you'd buy in the cans from Halfords or whatever. So clean up your worm gear first of all, inside and out. This is the worm gear, by the way, because I suppose in some respects it looks a bit like a worm. And I'm going to go and get the light, and I'll show you exactly what we're looking for. Now, this won't necessarily be that easy to show you.
Now, focus okay on that for everyone? Yeah, I think it's...
Is it okay?
It's okay on the screen here, so...
Now, again, it's not going to... You may need to do two hands there, and if you can just shine the light. So I'll try my best. This is very, very difficult to show because of how close we have to be, and I don't know how well it's focusing. So on this worm gear, there are these flat sections which are running diagonally up the shank of it, basically. And what you want to be paying attention to is any sections that are very shiny. Now, I'll show you, for example, a section that's not shiny. I don't know if you can see the difference. I'm surprised if you could. This part here, right where the tip of the screwdriver is kind of matte. It's kind of dull. That's actually good. That's what you want. You want a slightly rougher finish to it. But if I turn it through the light,
just come around a little bit, see if I can get a bit more square on.
I don't know if you can see, but certainly on 1, 2, 3, to me it's clear, but I apologise if it's not to you. There's shiny bits. There's a shiny bit there, there's a shiny bit there, and there's a shiny bit there. Now that's where, so I don't know if it helps at all. It's not so bad there, not so bad there, not so bad there, not so bad there. It's shiny there, it's shiny there, and it's shiny there. Just give me some feedback. Can you see that? Is that clear enough?
I think from
see that.
Yeah, from experience, once you actually see it in your hand, it is pretty obvious.
Yeah, I wish I could do something better than that. But when you hold it in the same light, it will be very obvious which parts are shiny and which parts aren't.
So, Dan, is there any concern over different wear patterns on it, or is it just likely to wear wherever?
It's more likely to wear, unsurprisingly, exactly where yours is worn. So you've got this smaller end at one end with the thread in it, and the wider end here, which when you assemble it, you kind of see how it goes. They do tend to wear more up here. The more worn it is, as in the more shiny sections you have and the more of the gear that it covers, the more noisy your TCT will be. The worst ones rattle all the time. Yeah. And then when I say worse, it doesn't necessarily mean the slack on the chain is worse. It just means that you're more likely to hear the noise. If you hear it from cold, that's usually because where the oil is a bit thicker, it's not getting into the mechanism. And then when it warms up, the oil thins, and it does, and the noise goes away. When you have a very worn worm gear, you're more likely to hear the noise when it's really hot because the oil is thin. And I'll show you just why that is in a moment. So again, very difficult to see in here. If you can shine a light in there, Andy, if possible. But these parts actually fit together.
Towards me a little bit more.
Like that?
Yep. Let's see if we can get some light in there. I think it's going to be quite difficult, but yeah, there we go.
These parts, drop the worm gear. These parts actually fit together, so they kind of screw in like this. So without boring you too much about the whys and wherefores, so we know this body is full of hydraulically pressurized oil, basically. This piston is being pushed in and out and acting on the timing chain in a variety of different conditions. The interface between these flat edges and the flat edges of the inside of this gear is what gives the chain its tension. And unsurprisingly, over the years and through degrading oil and other conditions, it wears smooth. They rub on each other, and it wears into that smooth and shiny pattern that you see on the gear. So all we're doing here is sanding that back to a certain level of coarseness to reinstate the metal that was once there before.
So presumably there is similar wear on the inside of that piston as well.
There is similar wear on the inside of that piston, correct. Now, this is the challenge. Some people sandblast this, some people sandblast this, and you know, there's reasons why you would do that as well. I don't tend to rework the inside of this. It's
Sorry, guys, the microphone's just turned off for us for a minute.
I'm not sure what you heard. I don't tend to rework this. It's very difficult, and also you run the risk of, particularly if you use media blasting, if there isn't finesse in it, you can actually take more metal off than you want. You'll get the finish that you want, but if you can imagine, if you take these surfaces down, either this one or this one, too much, the gap between them is wider, and you're more likely to get TCT noise. That's not to disparage anyone that does do sandblasting, but I use a manual method using sandpaper. I don't use a Dremel, I don't use a sanding disc, I don't use anything mechanical at all. I just rough up the worm gear, and as I say, depending on the level of wear that's in it already, my one hasn't made a noise, touch wood, for 5 years since I last did this, but some have gone in a year's time. So this is just my method. If you want to take them apart and give them to someone to sandblast, by all means. But you know, make sure that, especially this part here, make sure you get all of the media out, you rinse it properly, so on and so forth. So
if someone wanted to do that, Dan, would they just go on Google and find a local sandblasting company?
Yeah, anyone that you'd want to find someone that does media blasting on small componentry. So try not to find someone that does sort of garden furniture and even cars for that reason. Try and find someone that sandblasts small componentry or small electronics, anything like that. They're more likely to have the type of media you want. You probably don't want sand. You probably want a plastic bead, or they might even use hydroblasting. They might even use water. It's just kinder to the metal that's underneath it. But I'll go way off topic if we go any more into that. So, right. So I'm going to grab a piece of sandpaper, and it's really not going to be that thrilling, I think, for you to have to watch me sand this. So I'll show you what I'm doing, and I'll show you what a finished part of the thread looks like, and then maybe we take a break or something while I finish the rest of it. Unless you really want to watch me sand a piece of metal. But
maybe you can take a quick 5-minute break when you're doing that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to grab sandpaper. I'll do the first bit, and then we'll see what's what.
I'm just going to see how close I can get to this without it going out of focus. I think it's focusing till about there, yeah?
Is it?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, right.
Right, so this is actually 320 grit sandpaper. I would say 300 to 500 is fine, whatever you've got. Not lower than that, otherwise you'll make the surface too rough, and you'll actually end up sanding lines into it. If you make it too smooth, you defeat the object of what we're trying to do here. So I've used something around 400 grit successfully, and you know, if you want to do this job yourself, that's what I would recommend. So just going to clean it again, for obvious reason that oil is going to impede the sanding process because it's providing a lubricant. So once you've got it clean enough and ready to go, something I have, it depends what you've got in the garage. If you can grab a 5mm bolt, that's the thread size, not the head, you will actually give yourself something to hold on to rather than having to sort of trip over your own thumb and forefinger. So at the smaller end of the worm gear is an M5 thread. So if you just thread an M5 bolt into it, it'll only go so far. Now you can hold the bolt rather than trying to hold it all into quite a small space. It depends how deft and agile you are with your hands. So, like I said earlier, difficult in the light. I'll try and do what I can. So we are going to focus on, they all tend to be in a line, which is quite useful for me. So just as an indication, this bit is okay, but if I turn it clockwise ever so slightly, we come into the parts that are not okay. So like this
try and get a tiny bit closer there, Dan.
Yeah. So right now, on the part that's facing the camera, on this vertex here, these are the parts I'm not so happy with. So this bit's okay, right at the top thread, but this part, and this part are the parts I'm going to sand. And it's nothing more complicated than getting a bit of sandpaper and just roughing up, basically. So that's all I'm going to do. And again, I don't know how much more I could show them that. You're sanding it to the point that it doesn't look shiny anymore, and it looks like the parts that aren't worn. There's not a great deal more than I can tell you, but I'm holding the bolt, you know, just stopping it spinning, and I'm just roughing up for a bit. You don't need a lot, maybe 10, 15 seconds of Vertis. Wipe it off, and then if it doesn't look shiny anymore, you're done. That's all you can really do. So at that point, should we take a break?
Yep. So we'll leave that running. I know I've got to get rid of 3 cups of tea. So
yeah,
we'll be back in what 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, guys. I will leave the camera running just over here, but
you get a fetching view of my crotch or something else.
Let's put it against the components so people can look at that while we're waiting. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
See you in a little bit.
See you in a bit. Oh yeah, twist the handle. It twists the wrong way from the inside, and then lift it out. Even though we're over time, are we still okay for me to carry on?
Yeah.
Sure, good. I said I didn't want to mess with the schedule. I know 1 o'clock. I think we were going to do something else, but I can stop whenever you want.
That's right. 1 o'clock. We were just going to post videos and pictures, which we can do in the background anyway, so that's fine. If people are enjoying it, we may as well carry it on.
Yeah, I mean, if people are still logged on and this is in any way relevant, I'm more than happy to keep going. So there's no limit to the jobs we can talk about, at least, even if we can't do. It's a shame to have the garage door down, but it is a bit windy, isn't it? Yeah, it's just like I was just talking to the guy. I said, it doesn't seem to be a problem with running behind schedule. It's people are logged on, and if they're finding it useful, that's great. Yeah, cool. What I think everyone's actually tuned in for is the enormous twang noise and then the explosion when this doesn't work. So, there'll be plenty of time for that. And then I can show you an engine.
I was going to say, I know who will be rebuilding the engine if it does.
Yeah, this is one of the joys of live TV.
Yeah. So, Dad, just another question there. So, if someone was to ignore this rattle from the TCT, what potentially could happen? Is it a particularly serious issue that people should be concerned about?
My opinion is about failure points on cars, not just Hondas and S2000s, but I've had a couple of BMW. I have one now. I have a couple of BMWs in the past, 2 M3s, and I've had an M5, and those cars, there were any number of big, expensive faults and things that go wrong with them. But the thing I think is interesting is more around the science. So 364 days of a year, people don't log onto a forum and go, my car ran fantastically today. On 365th, they then make a post to say it doesn't work. At that point, these kind of issues, like the TCT, get a bad reputation. So in terms of how common the failure actually is, for the number of S2000s that were sold, it's actually not that common at all. There are any number of them have never had this problem at all. If you ignore it, however, as in it's become very, very obvious, and this fell so totally slack that your chain wasn't tensioned properly, one of the more common things that could happen is that you might end up what's known as jumping a tooth. So the timing chain, its primary job is to keep the bottom end of the engine, where the pistons and the crankshaft are, and the top of the engine, where the valves and the cams are, keep them in time. It's similar to what a timing belt does. If you jump a tooth, as the expression's known, that means that one or more of the camshafts have, on this engine it would be both, but has gone too far advanced of the crankshaft or backward retarded. And that would give you, if it's very minor, some timing problems, and it would run very badly. But if it jumped more than one tooth, you can actually, because this is what's known as an interference engine, you'd have parts of the top end of the engine, the valves and so on, interfacing with the pistons, and that's a posh way of saying smashing into one another, which would be fairly terminal. So that would be one of the main issues with completely leaving this. If the timing chain fell so slack that you could jump a tooth, particularly if it happened at high RPM, which it probably would for a number of reasons, you could wreck your engine. But that's the most extreme thing. For the most part, people who aren't mechanically inclined, who don't really pay attention to noises, you could probably live with it for a couple of years. You may never even notice. So if that gives you a sense of perspective, that's my take on it.
So generally, you'd probably get more annoyed with the noise before it gets to the point that
normally.
It would start.
But I would say if you had a track car and you were really, really using your S2000 to its limits, you would probably find that a slack timing chain would bite you in the arse faster than a gently driven road one, if you know what I mean. So that's the thing. I don't think that the mechanical problems that haunt a car are always as widespread as people say. I think it's more a nature of, nobody shares good news. They only share when something's gone wrong. Like, oh, my TCT's making noise. So I'm just going to charge this pack because it's run out. And then you've got to put your bumper back on, Andy.
Me? Where's your cable ties?
Oh, yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Right, I think we're probably nearly there. I'm going to do just a touch more. As an idea, guys, it's now got to the point I can barely see the shiny bits. So that's kind of what you're looking for. If you get a good light on it and you can't really see any shiny bits, you're done. It's I know it's really difficult to show you on a camera and from this in this sort of setting, but if you do tackle this yourself, when you look at it, it will be very obvious what you're looking for and when you've sanded enough back. And it's probably worth mentioning as well, I don't think, stop me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows who's connected, I don't think many garages would do this job for you. I think they would change your timing chain tensioner for you if you wanted them to, or you supplied the part. But I don't think they do this. So it's kind of a necessary DIY, and it's maybe I'm a bit sad, but it's quite rewarding as well.
So Bart's saying TGM will do it for 80 quid.
Oh, do they? This exact job, or they just swap it?
Bart, do they swap it, or is it? Do they actually sand it?
They do the same job, and they also upgrade the holes, so it's improved a little bit as well.
That's good. Yeah.
Andy, get your wallet out.
Yeah, because this is live. Yeah, it's 160.
Yeah. So. Yeah, mate. Yeah, at least.
How much am I charging you for this?
On that front, actually, how do we? Forgive me, I'm a bit of a ignorant person to this Google share. How do I share pictures to the forum? Because I want to show you guys my car, even though I haven't got it here at the moment.
What do you mean today?
Yeah, so I've got some images of it. Where do I?
Just email them. Just email them to us, and we'll share them on everything.
Okay, cool. That sounds good.
What email address should people use there, Ian?
S2KUK at S2KUK.com.
Great, thank you.
Even I could probably remember that. So, yeah, okay, that's good. Now I wanted to, as I say, I wanted to show you guys, but the one of the meets we have down here, the Red Hill one, that didn't happen either. Was that April?
Yeah.
Or March or something, and that didn't happen. So yeah, I've not had a chance to actually share the car with people. But
so whilst you're doing that, it's probably worth mentioning that we've got a really good relationship with Red Hill Honda. They have for many years now got some of their techs down on a Saturday to help people out with some particular issues on their cars. There's opportunities to get them up on ramps. We're hoping that perhaps now the automotive industry is opening back up. Perhaps we can look to maybe do something either later this year or perhaps early next year again. But I know I've had my car up there quite some time, and it's really useful to get underneath on the ramp, have a good look round. You get to talk to some of the techs there, who some of them I think are quite specialised in S2000s as well.
I'm curious to know, just since we're talking about this, how many of you guys take your car to main dealers, or how many of you have found independents? You know, if you'll stick it in the chat or voice it or so. I was just curious to know.
Independent. But he's an ex-Honda tech, Honda Master Tech.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got one here on Edinburgh.
Sophie's saying she takes hers to independent as well.
Yeah. It seems that the number of people going to OEM is down, or is going down. So.
I used to take this car to a Honda dealership simply to get the stamps in the service book, but because of its age, I don't really think that's necessary anymore. And Dan does a great service schedule for me, don't you, Dan?
Yeah, I can't get out of it really. I'm sort of this guy turned up, and I have to keep doing it now. He sort of compelled me with his puppy dog eyes.
I think it's clear that you both very much enjoy it. So.
Is that because we managed to spend about 3 hours on what would have normally been half an hour's work? In all seriousness, I can speed this up or stop completely.
No, it's great. I'm finding this really interesting because I'm completely useless when it comes to car bits, and this has given me the confidence to actually poke around a little bit.
So Dan is a perfectionist. I would probably have stopped sanding by now, but I'm sure he'll just make sure that there's nothing else that needs to take this out again in the not too distant future.
I hope not.
Yeah.
That is about as good as it's getting. Again, I can show you, but if you were watching earlier, you're looking for just a matte uniform surface. So there's no real shiny bits worth mentioning.
So we might have mentioned this, Dan, but there's no way we can just get a new worm gear.
I don't think so. Certainly, I'd be very, very keen to know that. If you could buy these two parts together, the piston and the worm gear together, you'd alleviate all of this question. But I don't think you can.
Okay.
This part won't be made by Honda. It'll be made by someone else, I think. But whether you can get spares for it, I certainly am not aware. Yep. Please, if someone knows, that would be brilliant. Right. I'm now done about as far as I can go here.
Something from Martin here. I used main dealer till. Oh, sorry, Martin, I've lost your message. Perhaps someone can read it out for me.
Main dealer till.
I used main dealer till the extended warranty ran out, but being in the trade, I didn't pay normal prices. Now I just do it myself. Lucky to get access to a workshop and a ramp, though. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, again, it depends what the appetite is to keep doing things, but doing a full service on this car is not daunting. The most arduous part is the valve adjustment in terms of time consuming, but diff fluid, gearbox oil, engine oil, spark plugs, filter, pollen filter, it's all really, really easy stuff. You just need to know where to look. So.
Yep.
Right. I'm going to start the reassembly now. Key part of all reassembly is just to clean everything. And then I'll show you how to actually put it back together in a way that you can refit it to the car. I'll go at this junction and talk about two things. When you need to compress this piston and this whole assembly such that you can fit it back in the car. If you don't, you won't have sufficient clearance to push the TCT back into the engine. So you have to compress the piston in one of two ways to make the whole unit short enough to refit back in. Now, as I said, there's two different ways you can do this. Risk is not a word I want to use for this, but there's one method that is more, how's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot more likelihood of failure than the other. and that's pulling the pin out method. It makes it sound a bit like a grenade. I'll show you both just for interest, but I'm not going to do the pulling the pin out method on this one today for two good reasons. First of all, it would be just my luck if I cocked it up and dropped the pin inside the timing case. Then we'd have an impromptu cut, and you wouldn't see me again for the rest of the afternoon. And the other reason is there's the bolt hole that you manipulate it through has a washer behind it, an oil sealing washer, and I don't have a replacement here. You probably could reuse it, but if I loosen it and put it back together, you get an oil weep from there. That'll annoy me. So you don't have to touch that port at all. I'm going to do it the other method, which is using a screw that I make up, which keeps it in tension. So I'll explain both. I'll show you both. But I won't do the pull pin method. I'll do the lock nut method. It will make sense when we go. Anywho, so as you saw earlier, I've sanded that gear about as far as I think it needs to go. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of cleaning and try and refit as clean as you can. Or there will always be a bit of oil residue in the TCT. You can't do a lot about that. It's not a problem because it will immediately be filled with oil again. All I would say to that is try not to use any chemicals in this area that aren't solvent-based, that don't evaporate. What is that question?
That's a question. There's someone with some background noise. Mr. Minns.
We are.
Okay.
Yeah, try not to use things that don't evaporate because you don't really want to contaminate oil in this area. So you can reassemble with clean engine oil if you want to, but for cleaning out, this is just breaking up fluid. There's nothing about it. So try and clean all parts up as best as you can. You know, I don't recommend using anything that's sticky or normal like detergents because you don't want to contaminate the oil.
Is there a way to clean inside that piston, or would you not?
You don't really have to. I mean, it's hollow. Where I've taken the oil jet out, you could clean it. You can put blue roll in there, but it's not so necessary because this brake cleaner, it's already flashing off. It's already evaporating, so there'd be nothing left behind.
Yeah.
And because it's a high pressure system, it will be full of oil as soon as you start the car. One thing I will show you just before I reassemble. The reprofiling work, each person does it a bit differently, but some of these holes and ports that you can see in the unit are, that's a bolt hole, but they get changed in size and diameter in one of many fixes to stop this TCT rattling. Again, everyone does it slightly differently, but if someone says that they rework or they reprofile TCTs like TGM, which I think someone just said a moment ago, this is the kind of thing that they're going to be messing around with, just for interest. So that's clean, that's clean. Right. So when you've got this stuff to a point, you're more concerned with particulate. So you want to try and keep grit and dirt and dust and all these things out of it as best as you can. When you're ready to reassemble, as I said earlier, you can't really go wrong. Watch the video back if you want to, if you were doing this and you were unsure, but the parts can't really fit in the wrong way. So put the main spring in first.
And that spring goes in.
It just goes
either way.
Doesn't matter. There's no orientation on it. No. So either way, and then put these two together. So you've got your center pin, or your tab, and again, there's no particular way of doing this. As a kind of sense of peace of mind thing, that won't go in the hole. So you can only put it in that way. Which is fine. I'm just going to get that out of the way. And then you've got this part here. When you look at the worm gear, you've got the smaller end, which has that 5mm thread that I showed you earlier, and you've got the larger end here. Again, you can't really put this the wrong way. So I showed you earlier, you can't put that in there. It can only go that way. These two can only fit together a certain way. But because it's on a spring, I don't know if you can see that, as soon as I let it go, it spins back like that. This is the crux of what you have to overcome when you come to fix it together. No matter how much I spin that down, it will keep trying to lift itself off the thread. So put them together lightly, bearing in mind that they will come apart, but they will engage together, and put this whole unit back into the body. You don't want to go in that way. You want to go in that way with the worm gear like this. Now that's about as far as I can push it. No, you would not be able to put that back in the car. So what you need to overcome is both a twisting and a locking motion. So I can twist this down. I'm using my thumb to hold tension, and I'm actually twisting this, and that's getting shorter. which is what you want to do.
Just turn it a bit more towards the camera. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
It's quite slippery, but that's getting shorter. Problem I've got, as soon as I let go, comes straight back out again, and I can't push it down again. That's how the tensioning system works. So what do I do here? Well, you can use a bolt like this to actually put in the back, tighten up, and it will pull the worm gear down and thus pull the piston down. That's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm not going to use this bolt. I'm actually going to use one I made earlier, which I'm just going to get from the kit. So this is my TCT kit. It looks horrendously complicated, but it's really simple. Same bolt as the one I've just taken off here, nut, washer, and a wing nut.
Just turn it towards the camera a little bit there. There we go. Can you all see that? Yep.
And in many cases, depending on how stubborn these are, you don't even need the wing nut or the washer. So if I take those off, I'll show you exactly what I want to do. I can't remember the exact length, but if you're going to a hardware store or something, get a longer version of this than you need and just get a nut to take up the difference. It has to be long enough to reach the thread. I'll show you again. It has to be long enough to reach this thread here that I showed you earlier through the back of where the main oil jet goes. So
yes, if we can get the camera.
Yeah.
That way.
So that doesn't quite reach. It's not quite engaging. So what I'm going to do is using my thumb again. Again, I'm sorry if this is difficult to see. I'm applying downward pressure with my thumb, and I'm also just turning clockwise because you're trying to close the piston onto the worm gear. It only needs to come in a little bit with this length of bolt. And then I put the bolt in the back in the main hole. It'll be very obvious. You could put it in others, but it wouldn't do anything. When you put it in, you'll feel it engage with the worm gear. I can feel it's engaged now. Now, when I turn this bolt, it will start to pull in the worm gear. You might need to use a ratchet, but it will start to pull it in.
Can we just show the viewers which bolt hole you put that
Yeah,
in?
I can start again if you like.
Yeah,
so
just to show us where it's actually fitted. So it's the one in the middle there, the
one in the
largest
middle.
one. Yeah.
So you've got two oil orify, if I use the right word, and these are for the cap, these thread holes here, oil jets, and there's only one it can go in. And you'll feel it. As you put it in, you'll feel it lock in. So keep turning and keep pushing the worm gear down and use this bolt to stop it coming back out and to pull it in. Like, I don't know if you can see that. I'm turning the bolt now and it's pulling the tensioning piston in. Can you see that? So I can let that go now and it's locked. Keep turning. And I'm going to get a ratchet on that because it's a bit too tight for my hands. So I'm just going to turn this on.
Chen is asking, is that a 5mm or?
It's an M5.
It's an M5, yeah.
It's an M5 bolt, correct. Right, so I'm working and turning this in now. So yeah, any M5 bolt will do. Now, that is about as far down as you want to go. Now, the reason I put the nut on there is so it's now holding it to the valve body. I wouldn't want to play football with it, but it's not coming loose, basically. So that's secure. Now, this is where the methods differ. If I pull this down just a little bit more, I don't know how well you can see, there's a hole there and a hole on the other side. Can you see that? I'm just going to go and get the other part of this assembly.
So Jill, so Bill's saying, so I'm actually picking up some of these questions on the chat, but they're disappearing quite quickly. So could someone just read out the last two that came in?
So Lawson said, was it a 5mm or a 6mm bolt, please, Tar?
M5.
Yeah.
And Jill and Bill said, suggest a washer to prevent nut damaging face.
Yep, you could do. But what I would say is it's really not that tight. I do have a washer as part of the kit. But something I've learned, I take the chance between that nut sitting in the recess, which it probably wouldn't cause harm, and using a washer, which might, if that spun loose, that would go flying out. So I take the chance and use the nut. You don't have to do either in a moment, which is what I'll show you. So yeah, use a washer if you want to, by all means. If you use a spring washer, like, just to give people an idea. So again, I'm not sure how familiar people are, but this is a more conventional washer. This is a spring washer. You can see it's split. reason why it's a spring washer is as you compress it, these the split angles line together and it produces a springing effect that would naturally keep the bolt in tension. So you could use a spring washer if you wanted to absorb the twisting force without the risk of it spring back or marring the surface.
Then Martin's asked, is there any reason why I couldn't just rebuild the complete unit and refit to the engine using long bolts which could be swapped out one at a time after it was fully home against the block?
Yes, because you, as you're pushing in on the guide, you'll end the guide out. It's a good question, but it's very hard to describe without actually feeling it. But the worm gear and the piston and the way that they interact, there's two mechanisms there. The spring is pushing it out, but the worm gear turning against the piston is what's doing the tension. Without that bolting, and you press it firm, you can't generate sufficient force to make the worm gear turn in the piston, and it will just butt out. It'll just be completely stopped, and that will make the whole assembly longer, and that will push on the chain guide, and it will push it into the back or the limit of the guide. Sorry, we're on mute.
So we're on low battery here, I'm afraid, guys.
Okay, is yours charged? Should we swap?
I've got a feeling I didn't turn the switch, to be honest with
you.
No, you didn't. Down. Okay. Okay. We might.
How low's low?
I was about 12%. It charges quite quickly.
Yeah, so that's in 20.
Yeah, we're going to just carry on here for a little bit.
Yeah, I know I didn't probably fully answer your question. Yeah. You won't be able to. Those bolts will be really tight. And even if you could generate enough force tightening them, you're going to be pulling in bolts against an aluminium part of the engine, and you don't want to put that much force into it. You'll probably strip them out. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Martin says, cheers, good explanation. And Lawton says, nylock nut, ?
Yeah, you could use a nylock nut if you wanted to. That would stay firm on the thread as well. So a nylock nut, for anyone who doesn't know, is a nut that has a vulcanized rubber insert that keeps it locked on the thread. This is just a little tool I've made together. It could be a lot better for sure, but this is just what I use. It's fundamentally use a 5mm bolt with whatever derivation of nut and washer you want to use. So,
you getting bored, Ian?
I'm not reading Ian's question out.
No, don't read Ian's question.
It's about nuts, isn't it?
It's about flanges again.
Okay, yeah. Well, we can get underneath. Anyway, so one method of this is an old Allen key. I want to say 2mm. I could be completely wrong. One method that people use with this is you actually put this through the hole.
Just get down there.
Through both holes, should I say. Let's just push that down a little bit more. Hold on.
By the way, if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask the questions rather than have them read out, they're more than welcome to.
Yes,
sure.
But it's difficult for me because they pop up on the screen quite quickly, and to try and film and read them at the same time is a bit tricky.
Yeah.
So Jill. Sorry, not too quickly. Right, let's just...
Jill and Bill said washer and 2 nuts so you can lock them out to prevent movement.
Yeah. All of those things is true. Whatever way you want to do it, its basis is a 5mm bolt with whatever nuts and washers you want to use. The key thing is that it holds it firm and it doesn't let the piston slip back. So yeah, you make of that whatever you want to. So I've jammed this chopped down Allen key, and it gets more complicated than this. I've had to take off the shorter end of it because it doesn't fit through a hole, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. This is one method of doing it. So with this old Allen key or a locking pin or a split pin or whatever you want to use going through these two holes, I could now take this bolt out. And what it would do, the piston would come to the limit of this and it would stay there. Now, if we go over to the car, I'll show you what the rest of that would entail. So what I could now do is put this TCT back in the hole that we took it from earlier. So imagine that that's in there, and I'm actually just going to put that into the engine. And I'll come around the front of the car and I'll show you what the bit I was on about earlier. Now, rather neatly, because Andy has an aftermarket intake, it's a lot easier to see. Here, you need, I think, is it out of focus? On the front of the engine, you have this, I think this is a 6mm Allen, I can't remember exactly. You would take this out, and behind it there's a sealing washer, which is the one I don't have a replacement of. And what you would end up with is a hole looking directly into the timing chain mechanism. So as you put the TCT back in, and you could bolt it in, that Allen key would be lining up perfectly with this hole. So you'd get a set of mole grips, lines with needle nose pliers, pardon me, not mole grips, and you just pull the pin straight out. So the reverse, if you imagine, it's hard to describe from this angle, but that would be sitting in there like so, and that Allen pin, that Allen key would be perfectly in line with that hole. You get your linesman's on it, pull the pin out, and it would pull up to tension. Obviously, you'd want to have had bolted in the TCT first, but I don't want to take that bolt out and renew that washer.
Is that Allen bolt in there because that's how they do that in the factory?
They do. That's how they do it in the factory. I can't think of any other reason why you'd have that. But because this part of the engine there is oil pressure behind it, it has a sealing washer.
Yeah.
So that's one way of doing it. It's the way I'd normally prefer, but I don't want to risk this washer leaking because it is a crush washer when you tighten it up. So I'm going to do it the other way, which isn't much more complicated. I'm just going to take that pin back out using a set of grips. There they are. And I'm just going to put it back to tension with this nut and bolt in there. So take that back out. And this is ready to put back in. So if we clean everything up as best as we can, I recommend smearing some engine oil or WD-40 if you want the engine oil is better because it won't contaminate, just around these. So when you put it back in, you don't risk snagging the rubber seal or chafing it or anything like that. You can have your own ribald jokes there if you want to, I don't mind.
So we had a question from Martin, I think, which just says, how many people have tried the Allen key, the Allen key method? And sorry, I missed the last line.
How many folk done the pin method and found they've put the Allen key in from the wrong side?
Yeah.
More than 100 times. Let's put it that way. So to make that live for people, that's a very good point. The TCT goes, you can see from the offset holes, the TCT goes in a certain way. So if you've aligned your Allen key the wrong way, you ain't ever going to pull that out. And if that makes sense, worst comes to worst, you just take it back out and swap the pin round. But for what we're doing today, there's no pin involved at all. So.
Is it easy to see that pin through that Allen bolt?
You want me to do it, don't you?
No, I don't want you to do it, but I'm just saying for the viewers.
It's very easzy to see. You could see it, yeah. You won't miss it.
So it's not a case of feel it with the.
No. And when you come to do it, I mean, I've got curved ended pliers here. But you want to use a straight set and probably a short one, which I may or may not already have out somewhere. Yeah, I think I've already got them out. You want to use a straight set to go through the hole, and then you'd be able to sort of get it on there and pull outwards, if that makes sense. So. This is just old, crappy. Well, it's not old. It's new, unused engine oil, but it's not actually the correct kind. So all I'm doing is just lubricating the seals. No flange here, just lubricating the ring. If that makes people feel better.
You're not using cheap oil in my car.
For the volume that's on these seals, I'm sure it will be all right. I'll take that chance. So, right.
When mine was done, Rob Rose was the guy who actually did mine for me. He used to own an S2000 up in North Norfolk. He actually used petrol to clean it.
Petrol? Yeah. It wouldn't be a problem as long as you evaporate it out afterwards. But as you say, for the volumes you're going to use, you could probably soak the whole assembly. For the volumes, it probably wouldn't be an issue. I just use brake cleaner. So you want something that doesn't leave a residue, basically, not a detergent or anything that leaves a film if you can avoid it. Right, and this is ready to reassemble. So when it's back in the car, you can imagine we're going to bolt it back in using the outer bolts. Then I'm going to take this bolt out, and the piston is going to come forward and engage with the gear, with the guide relief, which is what you want. And then it will just be a matter of screwing the oil jet back in, putting this cap back on, and lightly torquing, and that's it, really. So let's get this back in.
So Ian, I think we'll carry on. We'll get this back in, and then probably just take a pause and see how we're doing for time. Yeah. Okay. And I think the feed's going.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, we've run out of what we said we would do, but we're fluid and people are enjoying it, so that's fine. We don't need to show videos through this. We can carry on doing this if you are happy to.
More than
we can feed out all the people's contributions and videos through YouTube, etc. And
I'm just popping the videos up on Facebook as well at the moment. So if folks want to go in and like and comment and stuff, that would be brilliant.
Yeah. So,
Dan, do you need to worry about lining up the end of the piston in the guide? You said there were two little flaps on the end of the piston.
Yeah, great question. And no, you don't. When I take this bolt out, basically the whole thing spins, and it will spin until they engage. You can actually get quite a satisfying click when it engages.
Super, thanks.
So yeah, it's a good question, but no, it will engage itself. You'll hear it. It can't go wrong. Basically, it will turn till it hooks in. So. Right, nothing simple. I've just wiped around the area, making sure that there's not, excessive oil there. I'd already lubed these seals, and they're free of grit. So try and carefully, without touching anything on the outside of the engine, as best as you can. Put the TCT in. You can give it a little wiggle. He says. See if I can get it. There we go, that's in. And now I'm just putting the original bolts back in. I'm not tightening them up fully. I'm just you won't want to tighten them up fully at this point until the end. So again, sympathy in this area is important. You don't want to over tighten things. You don't want to cross thread anything if you can possibly avoid it. So.
This is really tricky on the camera angle, but I'm just doing my best here.
Yeah. Sorry, I've got to get that one in.
Guy's joined us. Hi, Guy. Welcome back.
Hi, everybody.
But he's been quite stubborn. Apologies, sir. Finding the thread.
I'm just going to back off a bit here just to give Dan a bit more space.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not doing anything particularly scientific. Just find the thread, and it will go in. It's just a bit awkward from that. It's actually quite. I didn't realise how difficult it is to maintain social distancing while you're doing work like this. So.
I think we're doing quite well. We had to find out in 5 or so days, wouldn't we?
Yeah, at least. Yeah, so you're on now to refurb a TCT, but Andy and I will be in the hospital. Yeah, this is proving quite the challenge, this one. Tell you what, Andy, while we wait, do you want to just grab the cap? So just grab that cap on the other.
What we should have had is some background music to play while we're doing these little things.
I could do that on YouTube if I was clever enough.
There's the 2 bolts there, mate.
Can't do it on the Google, though.
You sing for us, Ian?
No. Don't do singing.
Right, so I managed to make them take up. So there are 2 bolts in the cap. So again, nothing scientific here. Just take your time, get the bolts threaded. The TCT will only go back in one way, and otherwise everything won't line up, and you'll know basically. So I'm only putting these 2 bolts back in finger tight. So you'll push it into the side of the engine. You'll hear it click as the seals overcome, and it will sit flush, or it should sit flush. If you had a gap, you'd be careful, because it possibly means that your piston has come back out, or that bolt's come loose, or whatever. So
we're down to 10% battery. Do you think we're all right?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Right. So those bolts are in finger tight now. So all I'm going to do with the bolts finger tight is I'm going to take out the centre bolt, the 8mm, the M5 one that we were talking about earlier.
See if we can get that.
I may not be able to do it with my hand. I'm just going to grab a 8mm ratchet.
I'm just going to drop the camera in there just so you can see that in position. Yep.
Right. So normally this will, once you break it free, the residual force of the piston going forward will just make the bolt free. Normally, but thanks to the enjoys the internet, let's see what actually happens. So I'm not doing anything particularly interesting here, but I'm going to use a long reach one.
Has anyone on the call actually done this at all?
As I say, I had Rob Rose do it for me and sat and watched him.
Yeah.
I'm guessing whoever asked about putting the locking pin in the wrong way has. But
yeah, it looks very easy. I would use an Allen-headed bolt for that, so because it'd be much easier to spin it out than having to get a ratchet on it.
Very good point. Yeah, that's probably a top tip, to be honest. So yeah, use an Allen if you've got an Allen M5. I don't think I probably have really, but I'll be honest with you. This is the tool I've used for so long now that I've just using it out of habit. So.
Just used to working on motorbikes, which are much tighter than that.
Yeah, this one's actually not too bad in the grand scheme of things.
Just while you're doing that, I mean, for those like me who've got quite big hands, is it easy to take that heat shield out to give you some more space?
No, it's a pain in the arse. Okay. There's 3 bolts, and well, there's 4 bolts. Three have to come out. One of them is it's like an eyelet. This one right at the back.
Yeah.
You don't have to take it out. You just back it out. And it lifts off. But you've got 3 10mm bolts to take out. That back one is awkward. I would do it, but with this far along in the job, it's possibly not worth it. Although this is getting quite stubborn. Trying to find someone else to blame this on, but it's just me. That's coming. There we go. I don't know if you heard that. It was a very subtle metallic pop. Oh, well, that's my bolt dropping, not anything important. That's a good noise. That means the piston's engaged. So get the bolt back. Good. So that's back in place now. So what I'm going to do, I don't know if you saw earlier, actually, I just put a smear of engine oil on that cover. So that's ready to go back on, but not before you put the oil jet back in, and you studiously left on the side. That could have been awkward. But, so yeah, oil jet just screws back in where the tensioning bolt was. Again, it can only go one place. And you don't need to be stupidly tight here. So I'm just going to screw that back in as much as my thumb and forefinger will allow. And if I'm going to poke the camera in, Andy, have a look.
Okay, is that focused okay? Can you see that? Yep.
So that goes back in, and I'm just using my short flat screwdriver just to tighten it in. Again, the pin method is probably easier, but you'll want to grab yourself a replacement washer if you do it. I'm sure it wouldn't leak. I have reused them in the past, but I'd rather not cause anyone that problem. And this method, you don't have to renew anything. So yeah, that's really just a nip up with a flat screwdriver. There's nothing too tight about it. And then the cap goes back on. Again, it can only go one way. I've put some engine oil on the seal, just to make it a bit easier. I can't actually see whether I'm the right way up here or not, but I'll soon feel it.
Light there, I can bring a light in.
Nah, it's fine. I think I was the wrong way up to start with. Yeah, that's better. Again, as I said, this cover will only go one way, or the bolt holes, and it's profiled to the TCT body, so you'd soon know if you got it the wrong way around. Just getting those in.
Dan, just a quick question. On the VTEC side of things, there's a filter in there. Do you ever need to clean it out after a period of time or change it?
It wouldn't. It's one of those things, you can replace it. If you've been on top of your oil servicing and your oil maintenance, I would say no. As you say, it's more of a gauze, like a particulate filter. So if you've been on top of your servicing, and no, you wouldn't normally need to change it. That's the lower one, as you say, behind the VTEC solenoid, or this upper one for where the pressure section is. One thing I have seen is if you ever have to take your sump off, for instance, for a baffled sump in or something, F20C sumps don't use a gasket; they use Honda Bond, and or a sealant basically. And if you're a bit over exuberant with it, some of that silicone can find its way into the oil and then into the oiling system. Now, the filter should catch it, but I have seen cars before. There was one I was working on not that long ago, where it had a fault from the oil pressure switch, and that gauze was that mesh filter was completely blocked up with lumps of old, what I assume was RTF or RTV silicon sealant. So no, you shouldn't have to change it, but it's a good indication when if you ever do come to have a look at it, how much particulates in your oil when you come to look at it, because it's a very fine filter. If that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does perfectly. It's because when I first got my car, I had a crack on the thread on the sump plug.
Oh wow!
I had a and I didn't notice it until after I'd had it for a couple of weeks. I took it out and found these drips on the floor. I thought that doesn't happen with a Honda, and somebody had over tightened the actual sump plug.
Yeah.
And I think it always had main dealer stamp, so they'd obviously got some young chap to crank it up and just so. I had to replace the sump completely, and I did use the Honda gasket stuff. And as it said somebody had already said to me, just be very, you need to use it, but don't get carried away with it. So
absolutely, yeah, definitely. It could, if you really overuse it, you can detonate an engine. You can kill an engine with blocked oil passageways, particularly to the main bearings and lower parts of the engine. So yeah, it's something to be aware of. Just enough, basically. I know that's not very scientific.
Yeah, I just didn't know whether it was good practice after so many years, just to, as they're all getting on a bit in time, just to have a little look. And I don't know whether you can still even get those filters, but I thought it might be something just to stockpile, just in case in the future. So just have a look.
Yeah, you can. You can get the VTEC body to the cylinder head gasket, but as in the one that the cylinder head side gasket, but you can't get this top one. I don't know if you were online earlier, but you have to buy an aftermarket version for that. So, but yeah, you can still buy them. I wish I had a spare one in here. I'd show you the part number, but you can find it on Lynx, Honda, or any other electronic parts catalogue. So,
cool. Thank you.
Right, last bit now. So we've got a nice cold engine. This is a 1/4-inch ratchet, as I said earlier. No heroics with this at all. So first thing I'm going to do is tighten up the cap. So again, it's a very difficult thing to show on video, but I'm not even holding the ratchet at its full extent. So feel it tighten up and bite, and a little bit more. That's it. There's no value in stressing these bolts at all. So just tie it and then a little bit more. That's all I'm doing. Just going to check where I was before. Make sure it's okay. So this is the cap bolts. So if you were unlucky enough to shear these off, to strip the threads, you'd probably be looking at a new TCT, or you'd have to drill it and put in a thread insert. But if you knackered the ones that I'm on now, which hold the TCT on, you'd have more of a job on your hands. You'd have to get a drill into where we are now, and you don't want that. So I'm going to use 2 hands just for precision. So a little bit tighter and a little bit more. That's it. Again, if you want to use a torque wrench, do, but you'll be tightening it, waiting for that click or that beep or whatever you're using, and you don't know for sure if it's feeling right, because the torque wrenches are usually a bit larger than what I'm using now. And that's it. Plug the VTEC solenoid back in, probably the pressure switch at least, and that's it. That is the TCT done. So there's not much more to show. I mean, I made it very long, but once you know what you're doing, if you're proficient, you could probably do that in half an hour or something. I'm sure that was about an hour.
Yeah.
But yeah, hope that helped. Hope that gave some people some insight.
So then you run up the engine and just top up the oil.
Yeah, I won't in case we have any other heat-specific jobs. But yeah, you'd run the engine. You would barely have lost enough oil to notice. You could check it if you wanted to.
Simon Penn, could someone read out Simon's comment, please?
Why doesn't Simon say it?
Yeah. Simon, do you want to read that out for us?
Simon says.
Simon's very quiet.
You on mute, Simon?
Simon says, if you do strip thread in block, you can helicoil. Is that a word? If you need to, no point re-drilling, as you'll never get good thread in an aluminium block. He's on his shed roof.
He's on his shed roof. Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
That's a different type of top down.
Yeah, very much so. So, does anyone want to know what a helicoil is? Are you that bored or interested? I can show you one.
I want to ask something about the timing chain, if I can.
Yeah, the timing chain, I think you said. Yeah. Should we swap phones just for the time being?
I think we're going to need just to have a 5-minute pause just while we swap over phones. S2K, ONED. Okay.
Yeah, because I need to charge this phone, and well, to be honest, we can plug it in there and I can talk to it if we're doing a few.
I tell you what, why don't we have a bit of a break, say for an hour?
Yeah,
we'll do some videos and chat and all that sort of stuff, and then come back in an hour or something.
So should we say we'll be back online at 3:30? Is everyone okay with that?
Yeah.
Sounds perfect. Thank you. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And in the meantime, if you think of a job or a question, just post it or bring it up in the Q&A.
And in the meantime, we'll get my front bumper back on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys. We'll see you at 3:30. Sorry, Ian? Didn't catch that.
I think it was Steve saying something.
I said, are we allowed to start drinking yet?
You can start drinking whatever you like.
From last night, to be honest. So this has all been done drunk.
Steve, from previous Megameets, you're just drinking continuously, aren't you? All right, guys. See you a bit later.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, how do I stop it?
Right. Thanks,
yeah,
guys.
Cheers, guys. See you in a minute.
See everyone in an hour. Check Facebook and like and comment and share any videos if you haven't. And I have to go outside and look at my new rabbit hutch. So catch you later. Mark's building a rabbit hutch while we're looking at TCT.
If anyone wants to stay online and carry on like chatting and stuff, that's fine. I'm going to start feeding some videos onto YouTube.
Okay.
So you can watch them on YouTube, and you can do all sorts of stuff in here.